Hello, welcome to Nytheric Horror. Tonight, enjoy 3 hours of true scary stories, mysterious encounters, and disturbing experiences. Ads may play during the first 15 minutes and after 2:30,000, with no mid-roll ads in between. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, and let the nightmare begin. I want to start by saying I do not tell this story much anymore. For a long time, I would only bring it up if someone turned on one of those ghost hunting shows and started laughing at it, and even then, I would only give half of it. But I trust you, so I am going to tell it the way it actually happened, including the parts that still make my hands go cold when I think about them too long. 3 years before any of this started, my younger brother Danny took his own life in his apartment 2 states away from where I was living at the time. I had missed 4 calls from him that same week. I remember telling myself I would call him back on the weekend, that he always phoned when he was bored, that nothing about that week felt any different from 100 other weeks. I was wrong about that, and I have spent every year since trying to explain to myself why I never just picked up the phone. That kind of guilt does not really leave you. It gets quieter over time, and then something happens that makes it loud again. I moved into the house on Larkspur Street about a year after his funeral, mostly because I needed to be somewhere that did not remind me of him every single day, and because a job offer had come through in a smaller city that felt far enough from home to count as a fresh start, but close enough that I would not lose the people I still had. My college roommate, Jenna Kowalski, had just gone through a bad breakup and wanted a change of her own. So the 2 of us decided to rent a place together instead of finding separate apartments. The house was an old 2-story rental with white siding that had gone a little gray over the years, sitting on a quiet street with tall maples on both sides. From the window of the upstairs bedroom, the one that would end up being mine, you could see the porch roof if you leaned out far enough and looked down. The landlord mentioned the house had been sitting empty for about 8 months before we came along. Neither of us thought to ask why. We were just glad the rent was low for a place that size, in a neighborhood that looked that nice. For the first few weeks, everything about it felt exactly like the beginning we both wanted. We painted the kitchen a soft yellow. Jenna hung string lights along the back porch. I unpacked boxes I had been avoiding for a year, including one with photographs of Danny that I still could not look at directly. And I put that box at the very back of my closet, behind my winter coats, where I would not have to see it every morning. The first strange thing was so small that neither of us thought anything of it. Almost every night, right around 9 o'clock, the lights in whichever room we were sitting in would dim for a second and then come back to full brightness, like a flicker in the power grid. It happened enough times that I started noticing the clock whenever it did, and it was always somewhere between 2 minutes before 9 and 2 minutes after, never far off from that. Jenna joked that the house must be haunted by the electric company. We called our landlord, who sent an electrician out within a few days. He checked the breaker box in the basement, tested the wiring in the kitchen and both bedrooms, and told us everything was within normal range. He said older houses like this one sometimes had minor voltage fluctuations, especially in the evening when everyone on the block was cooking dinner and running their televisions at the same time. It was a reasonable answer, and for a while we let it be enough. Around that same time, Jenna mentioned something to me almost as an afterthought while we were doing dishes one evening. The kind of thing you say quickly because you feel silly saying it at all. She told me that on the days she worked from home, she sometimes felt like someone was standing in the kitchen doorway behind her while she sat at the table with her laptop, close enough that the hair on her arms would rise, though every time she turned around the doorway was empty. She laughed it off as she said it, the way people do when they want you to laugh along and tell them they are being ridiculous, and I did exactly that. Because it was easier than admitting I had felt something similar once or twice myself. a kind of pressure at the edge of a room that made me want to look over my shoulder for no reason I could name. Neither of us brought it up again for weeks after that, though I noticed she started leaving the radio on in the kitchen even when she was not listening to anything in particular, just to fill the silence with something other than her own thoughts. The banging started about 3 weeks after we moved in. It was not every night at first, maybe twice a week, always sometime around 3 in the morning. It sounded like someone had dropped something heavy on the floor, above or below, depending on which room you were in, followed by a few seconds of silence, and then the sound of a door being tested, the specific rattle of a doorknob being turned back and forth without ever actually opening. The first time it happened, I got up and checked every door in the house. My bedroom, Jenna's, the bathroom, even the basement door tucked under the staircase. Everything was locked exactly the way we had left it. I decided it was the house settling, something to do with the old wood contracting in the cooler night air, and I went back to bed telling myself that story, until I half believed it. Within a month, the banging and the doorknob rattling were happening almost every single night, right around 3, close enough to the same minute that Jenna started calling it clockwork, like something had scheduled itself into our lives without asking. We stopped talking about it out loud after the first couple of weeks, mostly because neither of us wanted to be the one who sounded crazy. I would lie in bed some nights and listen to my own doorknob turn back and forth on the other side of a door I knew for a fact was locked, and I would grip the blanket and stare at the ceiling until it stopped. And then I would not sleep again until it was almost time to get up for work. Jenna finally told her older sister about it during a phone call one Sunday afternoon, mostly because she needed to say it out loud to someone who was not living inside the house with her. Her sister listened for a while and then gently suggested that the two of us were probably just exhausted from new jobs and a new city, and that sleep deprivation on its own could make a person hear things that were not really there. Footsteps in pipes, doors in wind, that sort of thing. She meant well, and for a few days afterward, Jenna and I actually tried to believe her. We started going to bed earlier, cutting back on coffee, doing the small, sensible things a reasonable person does when they suspect their own mind might be playing tricks on them. It did not change anything about what we heard at 3 in the morning, but it did make us both quieter about it, because now we also had to consider the possibility that we sounded exactly as unstable as her sister's explanation implied, and neither of us wanted to be the first to admit we still believed something else was going on. It started showing on both of us in ways we could not hide anymore. I fell asleep at my desk twice in the same week and got pulled into a meeting with my manager about it. Jenna, who worked at a daycare, nearly dropped a toddler she was carrying down a short flight of steps because her legs gave out from exhaustion, and her supervisor gave her a formal warning. Neither of us wanted to explain the real reason we were so tired all the time, because saying it out loud made it sound like something out of a movie. And we were both adults with jobs and rent to pay. Not the kind of people who believed a house could do something like this to a person. But we were also the kind of people who checked the locks every single night before bed, twice, sometimes 3 times, because some deeper part of us had already stopped pretending this was normal. We decided to try handling it ourselves before doing anything drastic. Jenna bought 2 small motion-activated cameras from a hardware store and set one up in the upstairs hallway, angled toward both bedroom doors, and the other in the living room downstairs, angled toward the front window and the basement door. For a few nights, nothing showed up, except the 2 of us walking to the bathroom or getting a glass of water. Then, on a Thursday, the hallway camera caught something that neither of us could explain away. At 2:58 in the morning, my bedroom doorknob turned almost a full half turn on its own, slow and steady, like someone was applying careful pressure from the other side. And then it turned back to its original position, and stopped. No shadow crossed the frame. No sound reached the microphone except a faint, low creak of the door hinge settling under the strain. We watched that clip more times than I want to admit, and every single time, the two of us ended up quiet afterward, not really wanting to say what we were both thinking. Not long after that, Jenna had her own experience that she only described to me in a rush of words the next morning, standing in the kitchen with her coffee going cold in her hands. She said she had woken up sometime before dawn certain that her closet door was open, though she always kept it shut because Pepper liked to sleep on the shelf inside it. When she sat up to close it, she saw that every hanger inside had been pushed to one end of the rod. All her shirts and dresses bunched together tightly against the wall, as though something had been standing inside the closet itself and had shoved everything aside to make room. She told me the air inside the closet felt noticeably colder than the rest of the bedroom when she finally worked up the nerve to hold her hand near the gap in the door. Cold enough that she could see her own breath for a second before she pulled her hand back and shut the door completely. On the floor of the closet, in the thin carpet, there were two shallow depressions side by side, roughly the size and shape of bare feet, pressed down hard enough that the fibers had not sprung back up by morning. She had not screamed, she told me, because for some reason her whole body had gone still and quiet, the way you go quiet around something that might notice you if you make a sound. She stayed sitting up in bed until the sun came in through the curtains, and then she got up and photographed the marks in the carpet before Pepper could walk through them, saying she needed proof for herself as much as for me. She kept those photographs saved on her phone for months afterward, she told me later, though she never once showed them to anyone outside the house, the same way neither of us ever really explained to our families exactly why we eventually broke the lease early. That was around the time Jenna started digging through the county's public records out of simple curiosity about the house's history, not expecting to find much beyond old deed transfers and tax assessments. What she found instead was a short newspaper notice from about a year and a half before we moved in, mentioning that a man named Ryan Holt had died inside a residence on Larkspur Street. The notice did not go into detail, but a follow-up piece in the same local paper, printed a week later, mentioned it had been ruled a suicide and that the man had been renting the property alone at the time. It did not say which room. We did not ask the landlord because some part of both of us did not want it confirmed. But once I knew a man had died somewhere inside these walls, I could not stop wondering. Every time I walked past a particular corner of my bedroom near the window, whether that had been the spot. We brought in a small paranormal investigation group after that, a husband and wife team who did this sort of thing on weekends and had decent reviews online from other homeowners in the area. They spent a full night in the house with us, setting up EMF readers, temperature sensors, and audio recorders in the hallway, my bedroom, and the basement. Around 3 in the morning, right on schedule, their equipment picked up a sharp and localized drop in temperature just outside my bedroom door, nearly 12 degrees in under a minute, according to their sensor log. And one of their audio recorders caught something low and layered underneath the ambient house noise that the husband later described, almost apologetically, as sounding like more than one person breathing at the same time, though he admitted he could not be certain it was not just interference. He played the clip back for us twice on his laptop, turning the volume up each time. And by the second playthrough, even he seemed less willing to explain it away than he had been the first time. At one point, while reviewing the footage from the hallway camera together, the wife went very still and asked us to look at the far end near the attic hatch, where the picture seemed to darken slightly for almost a full minute, the edges of the frame losing detail the way a lens does when it fogs from cold, even though nothing else in the room showed any change in temperature at that distance. She said she had seen plenty of houses with drafts and strange wiring, but she had rarely seen a single point in a room behave like that while everything around it stayed completely normal. They left before sunrise, both of them quieter than when they had arrived, and told us honestly that they could not identify an electrical, structural, or environmental explanation for what we had been describing. They did not tell us the house was haunted. They just said they did not have an answer, which somehow felt worse than if they had. After that night, things started leaving marks that could not be dismissed as tiredness or imagination. I noticed it first on the white-painted wood of my bedroom windowsill, a cluster of small indentations pressed into the paint, evenly spaced, shaped almost like fingertips pressed hard into something that used to be soft, though the paint itself was old and long since dried and hard as stone. I ran my thumb over them more than once, trying to convince myself I was imagining the shape, but they were there every morning. And each week they seemed to sit a little deeper than before, as though whatever was making them was pressing harder each time. I tried covering them once with a fresh coat of white paint from a can left behind in the garage, thinking that if I could not see them, I might stop dwelling on them, but within 4 days the same shapes had risen back up through the new paint, faint at first and then unmistakable, as though something underneath the wood itself was pushing them back to the surface. Jenna's cat, a gray tabby named Pepper, who had lived with her since college, stopped going upstairs entirely around the same time and would sit at the bottom of the staircase some nights with her ears back, staring up into the dark hallway, refusing to move even when Jenna called her by name. Some evenings, Jenna would carry her up herself just to use the litter box on the second-floor landing, and even then, the cat would claw her way back down the stairs the moment she was set down, as though the whole upper half of the house had become somewhere she refused to belong to anymore. The confrontation that changed everything for me happened on a Tuesday night, close to 11, well before the usual 3 o'clock pattern, which is part of what made it so frightening, since some part of me had started relying on that schedule as though it were a rule the house had to obey. I had gone down to the basement alone to switch a load of laundry, something I had done 100 times without thinking twice about it. The basement at Larkspur Street was small and unfinished, with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, a washer and dryer against the far wall, and the old stone foundation showing through in patches where the drywall had never been finished. I heard the door at the top of the basement stairs click shut behind me, the specific sound a latch makes when it catches, and when I turned to try the handle, it would not move at all, as though someone had thrown the deadbolt from the other side, even though there was no deadbolt on that door, only a simple turn lock that I always left open. The bare bulb above me flickered once and steadied into a strange yellow color, dimmer than usual, and the temperature in that small room dropped so fast I could see my own breath fog in front of me. Then the smell came, thick and unmistakable, like wet river clay after a hard rain, mixed with something colder underneath it that I could not place. I heard a low pressing sound against the other side of the basement door, not a knock, not a scrape, but something closer to a wet, deliberate push, like a hand made of something soft being flattened against the wood. The door itself bulged very slightly inward, the old panel flexing under pressure the way wood should never flex, and a thin, dark smear began seeping under the gap at the bottom, glistening in the dim light. I backed away until I hit the washing machine, and I stood there frozen, staring at that door bulging toward me, listening to that wet-pressing sound get slower and heavier, until Jenna's voice came from the kitchen above, calling my name because she had heard the basement door slam from where she was standing. She wrenched the handle from her side, and it gave way immediately, easily, as though nothing had ever been holding it shut at all. When I ran past her up the stairs, my legs were shaking so hard I nearly fell twice. and neither of us went back down to check on the laundry until the next afternoon, in full daylight, with the basement door propped wide open the entire time. That night I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time before I could make myself lie down. And I found myself thinking about Danny in a way I had avoided since the funeral. I thought about how many nights he must have sat alone with something pressing on him that he never let anyone see. How he must have felt that same kind of cornered fear inside his own home, and how I had been too far away, too distracted, too unwilling to pick up a phone. To ever know what that felt like for him until something in this house decided to show me a version of it myself. I did not tell Jenna any of that. I just told her I was scared, which was true. But it was not the whole truth. In the weeks that followed the basement, things did not repeat in the same way twice, which somehow made it harder to prepare for than if the pattern had simply continued as before. One night it was only the smell, that same wet clay scent drifting through the upstairs hallway for a few minutes before vanishing completely. Another night it was nothing at all. A full 8 hours of undisturbed sleep that left both of us more unsettled than the noise had, because we kept waiting for whatever came next. Jenna's supervisor eventually gave her a final written warning after she nodded off during a fire drill with the children in her care, and my own manager quietly moved me off a client account he said needed. In his words, someone more consistently present. Neither of us said the word haunted out loud to our employers, because there was no version of that sentence that would have saved either of our jobs, so we kept showing up exhausted and kept pretending the problem was something ordinary we were handling on our own time. About 2 weeks after the basement, my parents came to visit for the first time since we had moved in. My mother had been wanting to see the house since we signed the lease, and my father, a retired contractor who did not believe in anything he could not personally take apart and put back together, mostly came along to make sure the place was structurally sound and not, in his words, some overpriced dump we had been talked into. I gave them my bedroom for their stay, the one upstairs with the window over the porch roof, and I told them I would be fine on the living room couch downstairs, which felt like the easier explanation compared to trying to justify why I did not want either of them anywhere near that room after dark. My father spent most of the evening walking around the house with a flashlight, checking the wiring in the basement, the foundation, even the attic hatch in the upstairs hallway, and by the time we all sat down for dinner, he had already decided the whole thing was nonsense, telling me flatly that old houses make noise and tired young women hear things that are not there. He had spent 30 years fixing houses far older and stranger than this one. He reminded me more than once over dinner, and he had never once needed a ghost to explain a bad hinge or a settling foundation. I did not argue with him. Some small part of me almost wanted him to be right, because if he was right, then none of it had ever really been happening, and I could stop flinching every time a floorboard creaked. My mother, on the other hand, kept glancing toward the staircase all evening in a way that made me wonder if she felt something in the air that she was too polite to mention in front of my father. I lay awake on the couch that night with a blanket pulled up to my chin, watching the dark living room window across from me, the one that looked out toward the side yard and the neighbor's fence line. A little before 3 in the morning, I heard it, a soft, deliberate scratching against the glass, slow and rhythmic, like fingertips being dragged and then pressed and dragged again. Never hard enough to be a branch in the wind, never random enough to be anything except intentional. I pulled the blanket over my head the way I had done as a child during thunderstorms, and I stayed like that, not moving, barely breathing, listening to that sound continue against the window for what felt like several minutes before it finally stopped. Somewhere underneath the blanket, I found myself thinking of Danny again, Of all the nights he must have lain awake alone with no one on the other side of a wall to hear him. And for the first time since his funeral, I understood, in some small physical way, what it might feel like to be too frightened to call out, even when you desperately wanted someone to come. Upstairs, my mother woke to the sound of footsteps crossing the bedroom floor toward the door, slow and even, the way someone walks when they are not in a hurry and know exactly where they are going. She told me the next morning that she sat up in bed, certain it was me coming to check on them, and watched the brass doorknob turn slowly to one side and then the other, the way it does when someone is testing whether it will open, except no one ever came through, and no voice ever spoke. She called out my name, thinking I was standing just outside deciding whether to knock, and there was no answer at all, only silence, and then the sound of the footsteps retreating back across the floor the way they had come. She did not think much of it in the moment, she told me later, because she assumed I must have changed my mind about checking on them and gone back downstairs. It was only the next morning, when I told her I had been under a blanket on the couch the entire night, too frightened to move, that her face went pale in a way I had never seen on her before. My father found the marks on the inside of that bedroom door before any of us said a word about the night. 4 shallow indentations, evenly spaced near the height of an adult hand reaching for the knob, pressed into the old paint exactly the way the ones on my windowsill had been, except deeper, as though whatever pressed them there had leaned its full weight against the wood. He ran his fingers over them the same way I once had, frowning, telling us it must have been done during a previous tenant's move, though the paint beneath his fingers was clearly undisturbed everywhere except in those 4 precise spots. My mother did not say anything at all. She simply looked at me, and I looked away first. It was later that same morning, while my parents were loading their car to leave a day earlier than planned, that I finally went looking for the box of Danny's photographs I had shoved to the back of my closet the week we moved in and had not touched since. I only meant to check that it was still sealed, some small ritual of reassurance before saying goodbye to my parents at the door. The tape across the top had been peeled back on one corner, not torn, but lifted carefully, the way someone opens something they intend to close again. Inside, the photographs were still stacked the way I remembered leaving them, except the one on top, a photo of Danny smiling on our parents' porch the summer before he died, had been turned face down. When I picked it up and flipped it over, there was a single smear across his face, thin and dark, the same wet clay color I had smelled seeping under the basement door 2 weeks earlier, already dried into the surface of the photograph as though it had been there for days. My dad died when I was 12, a work accident at the warehouse, where he'd been a shift supervisor for almost 10 years. The kind of accident nobody ever explained to me in a way that made real sense. Just a forklift and a stack of pallets and a phone call that changed everything about how my family lived. After that, my mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and we moved constantly, always chasing whatever rent was cheapest that month. 3 different apartments and 1 duplex in under 2 years before we ended up in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, the summer I turned 14. The house on Themis Street was bigger than anything we'd lived in since before Dad died. An old 2-story place near the edge of town with a wraparound porch, tall, narrow windows, a basement that smelled permanently of damp concrete, no matter how many times my mom tried airing it out, and a detached 1-car garage out back that we never once used for an actual car, since it stayed packed full of the previous tenants' leftover junk that Mr. Pruitt promised to clear out, and never quite got around to. The rent was almost too good for a house that size, and the landlord, an older man named Mr. Pruitt, who managed a handful of properties around town, mentioned only that the place had sat empty for a while before we came along. Nothing more specific than that. My mom didn't ask questions. She just saw a real house, with a real yard. Enough bedrooms that my brother Sean and I could each finally have our own space again. More room than we'd had since before Dad was gone, and she signed the lease within a week of seeing it. I remember standing in the empty living room that first day, sunlight coming through the tall front windows onto bare hardwood floors, thinking it was the first place since Dad died that actually felt like it might turn into somewhere permanent instead of just another stop before the next move. My mom kept using the word settle that week, saying we were finally going to settle in, get settled, like she was trying to convince the house itself, as much as us, that we planned on staying a while. For the first couple of weeks, it felt like exactly the fresh start we needed. Sean, who was 17 and about to start his senior year, claimed the bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway, and I took the smaller room next to the bathroom, with a window that looked out over the side yard toward the neighbor's chain-link fence. My mom took the room downstairs off the kitchen that had probably been meant as a den, saying she liked being close to the coffee maker in the mornings, though I think now she also liked being close to the front door, in a way none of us talked about out loud. Sean had brought a second-hand television into his room that first week, and most evenings that first month, if I couldn't sleep, I'd end up on the floor of his room watching whatever late-night show he had on, both of us pretending we were just staying up because we wanted to, not because something about the quiet of that house at night made it hard to settle down alone. My mom worked the evening shift at the hospital registration desk 3 nights a week, which meant those particular nights it was just the two of us in that big house, something that had never bothered either of us before we moved to Thema Street. The first thing that happened, the thing I still remember most clearly out of everything, happened about 3 weeks after we moved in. It was a Sunday night, close to an hour before my usual bedtime, and I went into the bathroom to take a shower before school the next morning. I remember reaching for the shower knob with my hand still a good foot away from it, close enough to see the water spots on the chrome, but nowhere near close enough to have touched it, when the water turned on by itself, hard, the pipes rattling once inside the wall the way they do when a faucet is opened too fast. I froze there for a second, staring at the spray hitting the bottom of the tub, before I turned around and walked out of that bathroom so fast I nearly tripped over the bath mat, and I did not go back in to shower that night. I told my mom the water heater must be acting up, and she said she'd have someone look at it, though neither of us really believed the water heater had anything to do with a knob turning on its own from a foot away. For the next few nights, I brushed my teeth in the kitchen sink instead of going near that bathroom after dark, telling Sean it was because I liked watching television while I did it, which he clearly didn't believe but never called me out on. He started doing the same thing not long after, though neither of us said why out loud, the two of us just quietly rearranging our evening routines around a bathroom we no longer trusted. The water in that bathroom ran cold for the rest of that week, no matter how long we let it heat up first. And my mom called a plumber, who spent almost 2 hours in our basement checking the water heater and the pipes running up through the walls. He came upstairs afterward, looking a little puzzled, told us everything downstream looked normal, no leaks, no obvious reason for the cold water or for a valve to turn on its own, and suggested it was probably just old fixtures that needed replacing eventually. My mom thanked him, paid him, and told Sean and me afterward that old houses were like old people, full of quirks that didn't always have a clean explanation, which was the kind of thing she said a lot that first year after Dad died, usually about things that had nothing to do with the house at all. She said it about grief, too, sometimes, when I caught her staring too long at a photograph, or forgetting halfway through a sentence what she'd meant to say next. Old wounds are like old houses, she told me once. They settle strange and creak when you least expect it. I didn't understand at the time how much more literally that sentence was about to apply to where we were actually living. Within a month, it wasn't only the bathroom. My mom started finding the kitchen faucet running in the middle of the night, always just a thin, steady stream. Never the kind of thing you'd get from someone forgetting to turn it off completely, more like someone had cracked it open on purpose and walked away. She began checking it before bed every night, testing it with her hand until she was sure it was fully shut, and some mornings she'd still come downstairs to find it dripping steadily into the sink. Cold water collecting in a basin that hadn't been there when she went to sleep. It was around this time that the footsteps started. Always at night. Always the same pattern. Slow and deliberate steps crossing the downstairs hallway and starting up the staircase toward the second floor. The first night, I heard them clearly enough to sit up in bed. I told myself it was Sean coming up from getting a glass of water, until I heard his bedroom door open at the same time from down the hall and realized he'd been in his room the whole time, woken by the same sound I had. We met in the hallway outside my door, both of us staring toward the top of the stairs where the sound had stopped. Neither of us saying anything for a long moment before he finally asked, in a voice quieter than I'd ever heard him use if I'd heard it too. I told him yes, and for a moment neither of us moved, both of us standing there in our socks in the cold hallway, waiting for the sound to start again so we could at least point to a direction it came from. It didn't. After almost a full minute of silence, Sean finally shrugged and said it was probably just Mom coming up to check on something, even though we both knew she'd left for her shift an hour earlier and her car hadn't been in the driveway when either of us last looked out the window. The hallway light at the top of those stairs had a habit of not quite reaching all the way to the landing, leaving a strip of shadow right where the stairs met the floor. And it was in that strip of shadow, a few nights after Sean and I first heard the footsteps together, that I saw something that made my whole body go cold before my mind had even caught up to what I was looking at. It wasn't shaped like a shadow at all, not flat the way a shadow should be, but had a kind of depth to it, a faint shimmer running across its surface the way heat shimmers over a road in summer, except the hallway was cool that night, almost cold, and whatever this was seemed to ripple slightly, even while standing still, like looking at a reflection in water someone had just disturbed. I could not make out a face, only the vague suggestion of a head tilted slightly forward. And for the few seconds I let myself look at it, the dread in my stomach felt less like fear of something jumping out at me, and more like the feeling of standing at the edge of very deep water, knowing you can't see the bottom. I turned my head away, telling myself I would count to 3, and it would be gone when I looked back. And when I turned again, the hallway was empty, though the air still felt heavier than it should have, like the moment right before rain. I didn't tell my mom about it the next morning, not because I didn't want to, but because I genuinely could not think of a way to describe it that didn't sound ridiculous the second the words left my mouth. A shape in the hallway that wasn't quite a shadow, a feeling like standing at the edge of deep water. I practiced the sentences in my head at breakfast, and none of them sounded like anything except a 14-year-old with an overactive imagination, so I ate my cereal and said nothing, and went to school carrying the whole thing by myself for the rest of that day. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay in bed with my eyes shut, telling myself over and over that it had just been my eyes adjusting to the dark, a trick of shadow and hallway light, and none of it worked, because the feeling of dread never actually left the room, even after the hallway had gone completely silent again. My mom had her own version of that same feeling about 2 weeks later, though she didn't tell us about it right away. She mentioned it almost casually one evening while we were doing dishes, the way you bring up something you've decided not to be scared of anymore, saying she'd woken to the sound of the shower running down the hall from her room, gone to check it, and found the bathroom door already open a crack, steam curling out into the hallway, even though the water coming out of the shower head was ice cold. She said she stood there long enough to reach in and shut the water off herself, and that just before she did, she noticed the drain was plugged, water rising toward the overflow, though none of us owned a stopper that fit that particular drain. She found faint scratches around the metal ring of the drain the next morning. Thin, parallel lines, like something with narrow fingers, had been working at it from underneath. She didn't tell us about any of this until we were doing dishes together, and even then she told it lightly, almost like a joke on herself, the way adults sometimes do when they want you to laugh instead of worry. Neither Sean nor I laughed. I think that was the moment all three of us understood, without saying it directly, that whatever this was belonged to the whole house and not just to one bathroom or one bedroom. It was my mom's idea to get the cats. She'd read something online about animals being sensitive to spirits, cats especially. Something about them acting almost like small guardians in a house that needed one. And even though none of us said the word haunted out loud yet, we all understood what she meant by it. She brought home 2 kittens from a shelter across town. A gray one, Sean, named Wallace, and a black and white one I named Biscuit. And for the first week, they were exactly what you'd want from kittens. Clumsy and playful, and completely uninterested in anything except chasing each other around the living room. That changed fast. Within 2 weeks, both cats developed the same unsettling habit of stopping wherever they were and staring fixedly at a single point in the air. Ears flat, tails puffed, sometimes hissing at what looked like absolutely nothing in the room with them. It happened most often in the upstairs hallway, right around that same strip of shadow near the top of the stairs. And eventually, both cats refused to go up there at all unless one of us carried them, digging their claws into whoever was holding them the moment they got within a few feet of the top step. Watching 2 animals react that strongly to something none of us could see made the whole thing feel less like something we could talk ourselves out of, and more like something we were all going to have to live with, at least for a while. Wallace stopped sleeping anywhere near my room entirely after a while, choosing instead to camp out on top of the refrigerator most nights, a spot he'd never shown any interest in before we moved to Themis Street, as though height alone might keep him safer than staying at floor level with the rest of us. By early fall, the faucet incidents had spread beyond just the bathroom and kitchen, and my mom had started keeping a small spiral notebook on her nightstand, where she wrote down the date and rough time of anything strange that happened. A habit, she said, made her feel slightly less powerless, even though flipping back through the growing list of entries some nights seemed to do the opposite. My mom found the hose bib on the side of the house running steadily one morning, the ground beneath it soaked and muddy despite weeks without rain, and a week after that, I woke up to find my own bedroom window fogged over on the inside, condensation running down the glass in thick rivulets, even though the weather outside had turned cool and dry. I wiped it clear with my sleeve, and it fogged over again within the hour, and I ended up sleeping with my door open after that, not wanting to be alone in a room that kept its own weather. I tried for a while to find ordinary reasons for all of it, the way I imagined most people would. I checked the window's seal myself with a flashlight, looking for a gap that might explain condensation, and found nothing except old, solid caulking that hadn't cracked in years, according to the sticker, still stuck to the frame from whenever it had last been replaced. I even asked a kid at school, whose dad did vac work, whether humidity could do something like that to a bedroom window, and he said, maybe, if the room ran a lot colder than the rest of the house. Though when I checked the little thermometer my mom kept on the kitchen wall, my room was reading exactly the same temperature as everywhere else. Sean had his encounter close to the end of September, on a night I remember, because it was the first time he came into my room afterward looking genuinely shaken instead of just tired or annoyed the way 17-year-olds usually look when something scares them. He told me he'd woken up because his blanket felt heavy and wet. like it had been left out in the rain. And when he reached down to check it, his hand had come away freezing. The fabric soaked through in a rough handprint shape near the foot of his bed, fingers splayed wide, though nothing in his room was leaking or damp anywhere else. He'd thrown the blanket into the hallway rather than sleep anywhere near it, and it was still there the next morning. Stiff and cold in a way wet fabric shouldn't get overnight in a heated house, a faint ring of mildew already starting to bloom around the edges of that handprint. Sean asked me, quietly, once we were alone in the kitchen the next morning, while the blanket sat balled up on the back porch where he'd finally thrown it, whether I thought it was actually a person, like a break-in, someone getting into the house somehow, without any of us hearing a door or window. I told him I didn't think a person's hand left marks like that, and he didn't argue with me, though I could tell he wanted to. The same way I wanted someone to tell me I was wrong about all of it, too. Neither of us said the word ghost out loud that morning, or any morning after. Like naming it directly might make it more real than the marks already sitting right there on the blanket in front of us. After that night, the three of us stopped pretending we were each handling our own separate coincidental problems. My mom moved a small television into Sean's room, and I started sleeping on the floor in there most nights on an old air mattress, telling myself it was just easier than walking back and forth, though we all knew the real reason none of us wanted to say out loud. Within another week, my mom gave up the pretense of her own room entirely and started sleeping on the pull-out couch in the living room downstairs, and it wasn't long before Sean and I dragged our mattresses down there, too. The three of us crowded into one room together, telling ourselves it was temporary, that we'd figure out the plumbing and the drafts and whatever else eventually, though none of us believed that either. My mom joked once, in that flat, tired way she'd started joking about everything by then, that we were basically camping in our own living room, and none of us laughed, though none of us suggested going back to our own rooms either. I want to explain something about my dad here, because it matters for what happened after we all moved into that one room together. In the 2 years since he died, I had gotten into the habit of talking to him sometimes, quietly, mostly at night, the kind of one-sided conversation you have with someone you're not ready to stop needing. I never told my mom or Sean I did this, because it felt private in a way I didn't want to explain, and because some part of me worried they'd tell me it was time to stop. In that house, in the weeks before we all ended up sleeping together in the living room, I had started doing it less. Partly because I was too scared most nights to focus on anything except listening for footsteps, and partly because some new and uglier feeling had started creeping in whenever I thought about him too long in that particular house. A feeling I couldn't name yet, but didn't like. Something closer to shame than fear. As though talking to him in that house risked getting an answer back from somewhere I didn't want an answer to come from. The worst night came about 6 weeks after we'd all moved down into the living room, on a night my mom had picked up an overnight shift at the hospital where she worked registration, something she rarely did but couldn't turn down with bills piling up the way they had been. Sean and I were alone in the house for the first time since everything had started, both of us on mattresses pushed close together in the living room. A lamp left on in the corner because neither of us could stand the idea of total darkness anymore. I woke sometime after 2 a.m. to the feeling of my ankle being gripped, hard, from somewhere at the foot of my mattress. A cold so sudden and total that it felt less like touching ice and more like touching something that had never known warmth at all. I kicked out instinctively, connecting with nothing solid, even though the grip on my ankle didn't loosen right away. 5 distinct points of pressure digging in like fingers, and when I finally twisted free and scrambled backward into Sean, who was already sitting bolt upright from the sound of my thrashing, the lamp in the corner flickered once and dimmed to almost nothing, casting the whole room in a weak orange haze. In that dim light, at the edge of the mattress where my ankle had just been gripped, I saw the same rippling, water-surfaced shape from the hallway, closer than it had ever let itself be seen before, its head tilted at that same forward angle, and for the first time I could make out something like a face in it. Not features exactly, but a kind of pulling and sinking motion where a face should be. The way a reflection distorts when something breaks the surface of a pond. Sean grabbed my arm and pulled me up off the mattress entirely, both of us backing toward the kitchen doorway, and the shape did not chase us so much as simply stop existing where it had been. The ripple across its surface, collapsing inward on itself, until there was nothing left but ordinary shadow in an ordinary corner of the room. Neither of us went back to that mattress for the rest of the night. We sat at the kitchen table, with every light in the house turned on, until the sky outside started to lighten. Both of us too wired to talk much. Sean gripping an old baseball bat he'd grabbed from the hall closet, without either of us really believing it would help against something that didn't seem to have a body you could actually hit. And when I finally looked down at my ankle under the kitchen light, there were 5 distinct marks circling it. Not quite bruises and not quite burns, a pale, waxy white where the skin had gone numb, cold to the touch even hours later, the way frostbite looks in the pictures they show you in school. I didn't go to school that day. I sat wrapped in a blanket at the kitchen table while Sean made coffee. Neither of us actually drank, both of us watching the clock, waiting for our mom's shift to end so someone older than us could be in the house too. My mom cried when she saw the marks on my ankle the next morning. Not the kind of crying that comes from panic, but something quieter and more exhausted. And she spent that entire day on the phone. First with Mr. Pruitt, who told her flatly that he'd owned that house for 6 years and never heard a single complaint like this from any tenant before us. And then with a woman from a local paranormal group she found through a flyer at the library who agreed to come out that same week. When the investigators finally left after their one overnight visit, they told my mom, much like the plumber had, that they couldn't explain the readings on their equipment or the cold spot that kept forming and reforming near the base of our staircase, no matter how many times they checked for drafts. But they also couldn't tell her definitively what she was dealing with, only that something in that house clearly was not settling wood or old pipes. My mom asked them, near the end of that visit, whether they had ever seen anything like it before, and the woman running the group hesitated long enough before answering that I understood the honest answer was no, not exactly, whatever politeness she used to phrase it afterward. We ended up staying in that house only a few more months after that. My mom finally breaking the lease early and eating the penalty rather than spending another winter there, and none of us ever went back inside once the moving truck was loaded, not even to do a final walkthrough with Mr. Pruitt, who came by himself instead and never mentioned anything unusual about the state we left the place in. Though he did ask, almost offhandedly, whether we'd want him to mention us as a reference for anyone renting after us, and my mom told him, politely but firmly, that she'd rather he didn't. The last thing that happened, the one I still think about more than any of the others, happened on our final morning in that house, while my mom and Sean were outside directing the movers, and I went back in one last time to grab a box of photographs from the hallway closet that I'd forgotten. Sitting on top of that box, in a frame I recognized immediately, because it usually sat on my mom's nightstand, was a photograph of my dad from a family barbecue the summer before he died, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. The kind of ordinary, happy picture that had sat untouched in that same frame for 2 years without anyone thinking twice about it. The glass covering the photo was fogged over completely on the inside, the way a bathroom mirror fogs after a hot shower, except the frame had been sitting untouched in a closed box in a room with no running water anywhere near it. And through that fog, faint lines had been traced with what looked like a fingertip, dragging slowly downward from the corners of my dad's eyes. I was 4 years old when the dreams started, and I want to say up front that I know how a grown adult telling you about nightmares from when they were 4 sounds. I've had people laugh, tell me kids make things up, tell me it was probably something on television I saw once and half remembered wrong. I used to almost believe that, myself, until I got old enough to understand a few other things about my family that made the whole thing sit differently in my chest. We lived, back then, in a narrow rental on Birch Hollow Lane, an older house with a steep driveway and a laundry chute that dropped straight from the upstairs hallway into the basement. The kind of detail that fascinated me as a little kid and terrifies me a little now, thinking back on it. My parents were young and stretched thin. My dad working long shifts at a distribution warehouse outside town. My mom home most days with me, and there was a quiet heaviness in that house sometimes that I couldn't have named back then. A kind of carefulness in the way my parents moved around certain rooms, especially the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall that stayed empty and closed the whole time we lived there. I didn't think anything of it as a child. Closed doors were just closed doors. I did try to open that door once when I was maybe 3.5, curious the way small children are curious about anything they're told to leave alone. The handle wouldn't turn, and when my mom found me tugging at it, she didn't scold me the way she would have for most things. She just crouched down, took my hand gently away from the handle, and told me in a strange, careful voice that it was just a storage room, nothing in there for me to play with. I remember her staying in the hallway a long moment after that, looking at the door herself before she finally walked away. The nightmares always involved the same figure, and even now, describing him. My skin goes tight in a way that has nothing to do with imagination. He was very tall, tall enough that in my dreams he always had to duck slightly under door frames, with skin the color of an old faded toy left too long in the sun, a dull ashen green with a strange waxy sheen to it, like something that would feel tacky if you touched it. He wore a long dark coat that hung past his knees, always buttoned to the throat, and where a nose should have been there was only smooth, unbroken skin, 2 narrow slits above his mouth doing whatever breathing he needed to do. His eyes were thin, glowing lines, the dull orange color of a coal about to go out, and when his mouth opened it, split wider than a mouth has any business splitting. Rows of small, uneven teeth inside, more like broken glass than anything that belonged in a face. His hands were the worst part, even before I understood why. His fingers were too long, and they stretched further when he reached for something, snapping back to a normal length the second he pulled away, like something rubbery being pulled taut and released. For the first year or so, the dreams were simple in the way nightmares are simple when you're that young. He would just be standing somewhere, at the end of my bed, in the hallway outside my door. Once at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at me, never doing anything except existing there, radiating a wrongness I didn't have words for yet. I told my mom about him more than once, the way kids tell their parents about monsters, and she did what most parents do. Checked my closet, checked under my bed, told me it was just a dream and that dreams couldn't hurt me. Some nights she'd sit on the edge of my mattress until I fell back asleep, humming something low under her breath. And I remember those nights as almost comforting despite everything, like whatever was out there in the dark of my room couldn't quite reach me as long as she stayed close enough to touch. I believed her for a long time, because I wanted to. I told exactly one other person outside my family about him, a girl named Casey I sat next to in preschool, describing him in the plain, matter-of-fact way kids describe things that are simply part of their world. She told her own mother, who apparently found the description alarming enough to mention it to my mom at pickup one afternoon, and I remember the strange. tight look on my mom's face driving home afterward, telling me it was probably best if I didn't talk about the tall man with my friends anymore, since it might scare them. I didn't understand then that she wasn't really worried about scaring Casey. I think she was worried about how it sounded coming out of my mouth in that much detail to someone who had no reason to have fed me any of it. My brother was born when I was 5, a small, red-faced baby named Eli who took over the nursery down the hall from my room, the room I now realize sat almost directly across from that other closed door at the end of the hallway. For a few months after he came home, my nightmares actually seemed to ease up. Fewer visits, less of that cold, watching presence at the edge of my dreams. I remember feeling almost proud of myself, like I'd outgrown whatever had scared me before. Then came the night that changed how my parents thought about the whole thing, though it took me years to understand exactly why it hit them the way it did. I dreamed that the tall man was standing over Eli's crib, his 2 long fingers stretched out over the rail, and in the dream, I couldn't move. Couldn't scream, could only watch his fingers get closer to my brother's small sleeping shape before I woke up gasping in my own bed, heart slamming. Certain in the specific, unshakable way small children are certain of things that it had actually been happening somewhere in the house right that second. I ran to my parents' room and woke my mom, telling her through tears that the tall man was hurting Eli, and even though she told me later she assumed it was just an especially vivid nightmare, she still got up to check on him, the way any mother would. Eli was fine, sleeping soundly, and my mom told me everything was okay and put me back to bed. It was a few hours later, when she went in to change his morning diaper, that she found it. Tucked inside, against his skin, was one of those sticky rubber hand toys you get from a coin machine at the grocery store, the kind kids throw at walls and windows to watch it stick and peel slowly free. Except this one was a dull, faded green, the exact shade I had described to her 100 times, without her ever quite believing the description mattered. Nobody in our house owned a toy like that. Nobody could explain how it had gotten into a sealed diaper on a sleeping infant in a locked house. My mom told me later that she stood in the nursery for a long time that morning, just holding it, turning it over in her fingers, before she called my dad at work, her voice tight enough over the phone that he left his shift early. Between them, they went through the entire house that afternoon, checking every window latch, every door, asking each other in low voices whether one of them could have somehow brought the toy inside without remembering, whether a neighbor's kid could have gotten in through a gap in the fence, exhausting every ordinary explanation before either of them would say out loud what they were both clearly starting to think. My dad even called the rental company to ask if a maintenance worker had been by that week, and was told flatly that no one had been scheduled or sent to our address in over a month. My parents never really talked about it after that, not in front of me anyway, though I know now they spent a long time trying to find some rational explanation, checking whether anyone had been in the house, whether one of us older kids could have hidden it there as some kind of prank, before eventually landing on the explanation that felt least impossible to them at the time, that the house itself was somehow wrong, something left behind by whoever had lived there before us. We moved out, within 2 months, into a brand new house, going up in a development called Cedar Run on the far side of town. A house that had never been lived in by anyone. Fresh drywall, fresh carpet, not even a full year old. My mom told the landlord we were leaving because my dad had gotten a promotion that required us to be closer to his warehouse, which wasn't entirely a lie, though it left out the part that mattered most to the two of them. For those first few weeks in the new house, I actually slept better than I had in a long time, and I think my parents let themselves believe the same explanation they'd settled on. that whatever it was had belonged to that old house on Birch Hollow Lane and not to us. The house in Cedar Run smelled like fresh paint and new carpet glue for those first weeks, a smell I still associate, strangely, with feeling briefly and completely safe, before it slowly became tangled up with everything that came after. I remember my dad saying something to my mom in the kitchen once, thinking I wasn't close enough to hear. That at least now we knew it wasn't something following the family around, something in his voice suggesting that idea had crossed his mind and scared him more than he wanted to admit. The dreams came back about 3 weeks after we moved in, and this time there was no old house to blame, no previous tenant, no explanation my parents could reach for that didn't feel worse than the one before. I was 6 by then, old enough to describe things more clearly, and I remember my mom's face the night I told her the tall man had been standing in my new closet, in a house that had never held anyone else's memories, anyone else's grief, anything he could supposedly be attached to, except us. My parents tried the reasonable things people try. My dad checked every window latch in the house twice some nights before bed, and at one point even had a technician come out to test for carbon monoxide. Wondering privately, he admitted to me years later whether bad air in a new house might somehow be causing me to hallucinate. The readings came back completely normal. They took me to our pediatrician, who suggested night terrors, a fairly common thing in children my age, and recommended a more consistent bedtime routine and cutting back on screen time in the evenings, which we did without any real change in what I experienced. When that didn't help, the pediatrician referred us to a sleep specialist 2 towns over, who had me spend a night hooked up to sensors that measured my brain activity while I slept, and told my parents afterward that everything on the readout looked like an ordinary child's sleep cycle. No unusual spikes. Nothing that matched what a night terror should look like on paper. My mom brought up the idea, once, tentatively, of talking to someone about whether the house itself needed some kind of blessing, and my dad, who wasn't a particularly religious man, surprised her by agreeing to have their pastor come by and walk through the rooms with them one evening, saying a few quiet words in Eli's nursery and in mine. Nothing changed afterward that either of them could point to, though my mom told me she'd felt calmer for about a week, which she said was probably worth something even if it hadn't fixed anything. My mom started leaving a small lamp on in my room after that, and for a while that seemed to genuinely help, until the night I woke to find the lamp switched off on its own, the room gone completely dark except for that same thin orange glow at the foot of my bed. By the time I was 7, I had learned to recognize the specific feeling that meant he was close, even while I was fully awake. It started as a coldness, low in my stomach, spreading out into my arms and legs until my fingers went slightly numb, followed by a feeling of dread so total it made my mouth go dry and my breathing go shallow, the kind of fear that has a physical weight to it, pressing down rather than just existing in your head. My little brother started showing signs of something similar around that same stretch. Too young yet to describe it the way I could, but he began refusing to sleep with his door open, something he'd always insisted on before, and he took to sleeping with a stuffed rabbit clutched so tightly against his chest that my mom joked he was trying to strangle it. He never said anything about a tall man, but he stopped wanting to be alone in the nursery even during the day, trailing after my mom from room to room in a way that felt, in hindsight, like more than ordinary toddler clinginess. I got good at recognizing that feeling coming on, and I got good at calling for my mom the second it started, though by the time she made it to my room, whatever had been building usually faded, leaving her checking an empty room while I sat rigid in my bed, unable to explain what she'd missed. That pattern held until one night, a few weeks after my 7th birthday, when it didn't fade in time. I felt the cold settle into my stomach the way it always did, spreading down into my legs until my feet went numb under the blankets. And I lay perfectly still, telling myself if I didn't move, he might pass by the way he sometimes seemed to. On to whatever else in the house drew his attention. Instead, the dread kept building past the point it normally stopped, thickening until my chest felt tight, and I finally made myself look toward the foot of the bed, where the closet door stood open a crack. Darker inside than the rest of the room had any right to be. Something came out of that dark gap before I could scream. A hand, too long in the fingers, stretching further than any arm should have allowed it to reach, closing around my ankle outside the blanket with a grip that felt simultaneously cold and slightly tacky, like touching something that had been left in a warm car too long. I kicked out hard, connecting with nothing solid even as the grip held for one more terrible second before releasing all at once, the hand snapping back into the closet the way a rubber band snaps when you let go of one end. I scrambled backward off the bed and ran for my parents' room screaming, and by the time my dad got the hallway light on, I was shaking too hard to form full sentences. When my mom finally pulled back the blanket to check on me, there was a ring of faint red marks circling my ankle, 5 distinct points where fingers had gripped, the skin between them tacky to the touch with a faint greenish residue that came away on her fingers and would not fully wash off my skin for almost 2 days, no matter how many times she scrubbed it in the bath. She kept asking me, again and again, whether I'd hurt myself somehow, tangled in the sheets, caught my foot on the bed frame, and each time I told her no, and each time I watched her want very badly to believe a version of events that didn't require believing me completely. It was around this time, during a visit to my grandmother's house for a holiday, that I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear, a conversation between my mom and my grandmother in the kitchen while the rest of us watched television in the next room. I only caught pieces of it, my grandmother's voice low and careful, saying something about how it wasn't my mother's fault, that these things happened and there was nothing anyone could have done differently. And my mom's voice, thick in a way I'd never heard from her, saying she still checked on him every 20 minutes back then, and it still hadn't been enough. I sat very still on the couch in the next room while I listened, some instinct telling me this was not a conversation meant for me, though I couldn't have explained why it made the cold, empty feeling in my stomach flare up briefly, the same feeling I'd learned to associate with him, even though he hadn't visited in weeks by that point. I didn't say anything to my mom or my grandmother that day. I just filed the sentence away somewhere in the back of my mind and carried it around for years without fully understanding its shape. I didn't understand what they were talking about until years later, when my mom finally told me, in a quiet, careful voice, much like the one I'd overheard, that I'd had an older brother once, a baby named Nathaniel, who had died in his crib 3 years before I was born, in that same house on Birch Hollow Lane, in what would have been the room that stayed closed and empty the entire time we lived there. I remember exactly where I was standing in our kitchen when she finally told me, years after the ankle marks had faded, both of us doing dishes the way we had that night, she first mentioned the shower running on its own in a different house entirely, a habit of hers, I'd come to realize, telling hard things with her hands busy so she'd have somewhere else to look. She said his name so quietly I almost missed it the first time, and when I asked why nobody had ever told me, she said there hadn't seemed to be a right time, and that some part of her had hoped I'd simply never need to know. I didn't know any of that yet, at 7 years old, only that something in our house seemed drawn specifically to Eli's room, to the nursery, in a way that felt different from how it had ever focused on mine. I started noticing that the coldness and dread came on strongest whenever I was near his door at night, and more than once I found myself standing outside it without quite remembering walking there. Some part of me pulled to check on him the way I now understand my mother had once been pulled to check on someone else. The worst night came during a stretch when I was running a fever high enough that my mom had set up a folding cot in my room so she could check on me through the night without waking the whole house. She'd been in and out all evening with a cool washcloth and a thermometer, telling me the fever would break by morning, and around midnight she finally dozed off herself in the chair beside my bed, exhausted from 2 nights of broken sleep already. I remember drifting in and out of a thin, feverish sleep, the kind where you're never sure what's real, when the cold hit me harder than it ever had before, a full body drop in temperature that made my teeth chatter even under 2 blankets, strange against the heat still radiating off my own skin. I opened my eyes and he was standing at the foot of my bed, closer than he had ever let himself be seen while I was fully awake, his 2 long fingers hanging loose at his sides, stretching and retracting slightly the way they did in my dreams, and this time his mouth opened, and a voice came out of it, flat and toneless, in a way that didn't match the volume behind it. A single word, loud enough that I was certain it would wake the whole house. Look. I turned my head toward my dresser, where my 2 dolls sat propped against the mirror the way I left them every night, and watched, my whole body frozen, as they moved against each other, small plastic limbs jerking and colliding in short, violent motions, one doll's arm bending at an angle no arm should bend. The sound of plastic knocking against plastic, filling the room even though nothing visible was touching them. I don't know how long I watched before I finally found my voice enough to scream, and by the time my mom jolted awake in the chair and got the overhead light on, both dolls had fallen still. One of them face down on the dresser. The other tipped onto the floor with its bent arm still twisted the wrong way, a small crack running through the plastic at the joint that had not been there the day before. She scooped me up out of the cot immediately, checking my forehead again, her hands shaking slightly in a way I noticed even through my own fear, and it was only the next morning, once my fever had finally broken, that either of us thought to look at the dolls again in the plain light of day. My mom held me for a long time that night, checking my temperature, telling me fevers could make you see and hear all kinds of things that weren't really there, and for a while I let myself believe that was the whole explanation, that 102 degrees had simply rearranged my dolls in my imagination. It was only years later, going through an old box of my things, that I found that same doll again, the crack still visible in its arm exactly where I remembered it, in a shape I couldn't have described accurately enough at 7 years old to have faked convincingly for anyone, let alone myself. After that fever broke, the feeling started coming less often, weeks between instances instead of nights, and by the time I turned 8, it had stopped completely. I never saw him again after that, never felt that particular coldness settle into my stomach, never woke certain that something tall was standing just out of focus at the edge of my room. My parents never brought it up again either. The same careful silence they'd kept around Nathaniel's old room on Birch Hollow Lane, settling over this, too. Another thing in our family that existed and simply wasn't discussed. For a long time afterward, ordinary things could still catch me off guard. The sight of one of those quarter machines at the front of a grocery store. The smell of a certain brand of baby lotion. A coat that hung a little too long past someone's knees on a tall stranger in a parking lot. Eli grew up with no memory of any of it. Too young at the time to hold on to whatever unease he'd shown as a toddler, and I've never once told him the full story, not wanting to hand him something that only ever really belonged to me and our parents. I have kids of my own now, and I'll admit I still get up more than a reasonable number of times a night to check on them when they're small enough to be in a crib, a habit my husband gently teases me about, not knowing the whole reason behind it. Only that I tell him I just like to be sure. It wasn't until last year, helping my parents pack up the house in Cedar Run so they could finally downsize now that all of us kids were grown, that I found the box. It was pushed to the very back of the highest shelf in the attic, unmarked, sealed with tape that had gone brittle and yellow with age, half buried under a stack of old holiday decorations nobody had touched in years. My mom hadn't come up to help with that particular corner of the attic, staying downstairs instead to direct the movers, and I remember thinking at the time that it was strange she'd left this section entirely to me and my dad. When I finally got the box open, expecting old tax paperwork or something equally boring, I found instead a small knit cap, soft and yellowed with age. A hospital bracelet with a name and a date I recognized immediately from the one time my mother had ever said it out loud to me, and a single curled lock of pale hair taped carefully to a square of cardstock in handwriting I recognized as my grandmother's, not my mother's, as though someone else had needed to be the one steady enough to preserve it. Tucked beneath all of it, flattened slightly from years under the weight of everything else, was a sticky rubber hand toy, identical in shape to the one my mother had found in Eli's diaper all those years earlier. Except this one was black instead of green, brittle and cracked with age in a way that made it clear it had been sitting in that box for far longer than I had even been alive. I sat there on the attic floor for a long while, holding it carefully in my palm, the way you'd hold something you weren't sure you wanted to be touching, listening to my dad moving boxes downstairs and my mom's voice drifting up faintly as she directed the movers toward the truck, and I did not call down to either of them to come see what I'd found. The rubber had gone stiff and cracked with age everywhere except across the palm, where a thin band of it still held some faint give under my thumb, still faintly tacky after however many years it had spent sealed away in the dark, as though some small part of it had never quite finished drying out, still faintly warm at its center, the way something feels right after it's been let go of. My mother almost never talked about the farmhouse that used to stand on our land before I was born, and when she did, she talked around it more than about it, the way people do when a subject has sharp edges they've learned to avoid touching directly. I knew, in the vague way kids know things about their parents' childhoods, that she'd grown up out on that same stretch of land in Ashford, Vermont, that her father had lived there his whole life, and that something bad had happened when she was a teenager that she never quite explained. It wasn't until I was older that I understood how much of my mother's life had been shaped by a fire that burned the original house to its foundation the summer she turned 15, taking her younger brother Daniel with it. She told me once, years later, that she'd been the one who smelled smoke first that night, half asleep in her own room down the hall, and that by the time she got everyone else awake and out the front door, she'd assumed Daniel was right behind her the whole way, only realizing he wasn't there once they were all standing in the yard watching the house go up. She never said much more than that about the actual night itself, and I never pushed her to, understanding even as a kid that there was a version of that story she kept locked away somewhere she didn't intend to visit in front of me. My grandfather Walter stayed on the land after that, living for decades afterward in a cramped trailer set up near the old foundation, refusing every offer my mother made to help him build something new, refusing most invitations to visit us, refusing, as far as I could tell, most forms of comfort in general. My mother visited him maybe twice a year growing up, always coming home from those visits quieter than usual, and by the time he died a few years before this all happened, the two of them hadn't spoken in almost 18 months. I only met my grandfather a handful of times growing up, always at his trailer rather than at our house, since he refused every invitation my mother extended for holidays. He was a quiet, weathered man who seemed to watch my mother more than he spoke to her during those visits, and I remember once, when I was maybe 8, catching him staring at the blackened remains of the old foundation from his trailer window, with an expression I didn't have a word for at the time, but would later come to recognize as something closer to guilt than grief. She inherited the land automatically, being his only surviving child, and for a long time she didn't know what to do with it, until my dad suggested, gently, that building a new house there might be a way of finally doing something good with a place that had only ever held bad memories for her. We moved into the new house in Ashford the summer I turned 13. My younger sister, Ivy, 9 at the time, both of us thrilled by the size of the place after years in a cramped rental across town. The house had 3 floors connected by a single narrow staircase that wound down through the center of the building rather than running along an outer wall the way staircases usually do. And at the top of each floor's landing, there was a solid door you had to open before stepping out into that floor's rooms. Something the architect had apparently included for energy efficiency, keeping heat contained level by level. Outside those doors, the stairwell itself had only a handful of bare bulbs spaced unevenly along its length, leaving long stretches of near total darkness between one weak pool of light and the next. It gave the whole staircase an oddly hollow, echoing quality, cold air moving up and down it, even when every window in the house was shut. And Ivy and I used to race each other down it as fast as we could, just to get out of that particular darkness and back into a lit room. My dad used to tease us about it, calling the stairwell our own personal haunted hallway long before anything actually happened there, joking that whoever built the house must have had a grudge against electricians. My mom never joined in on those jokes the way he expected her to, usually finding some reason to change the subject whenever the stairwell came up at dinner, though at the time I chalked that up to her simply not finding it as funny as the rest of us did. Looking back, I think she'd chosen that particular staircase design herself when she worked with the architect, insisting on the doors at each landing even though the contractor told her it would cost more and wasn't strictly necessary for the energy savings she claimed to want, and I've wondered since whether some part of her was trying to build in a kind of containment, sealing each floor off from the others the way you'd seal a room you didn't want to draft, or anything else, moving freely through. For the first several weeks, nothing about the house felt wrong, only unfamiliar in the ordinary way new houses feel unfamiliar. New smells, new creaks to learn, new spots on the floor that stayed cold no matter how the heating vents were angled. Ivy and I split the top floor between us, her bedroom and mine on either side of a shared television room, while my parents took the primary bedroom on the second floor, along with a guest room and the main bathroom, and the ground floor held the kitchen, dining room, and a long living room that still smelled faintly of fresh paint, months after we moved in. The first thing that happened, the thing that still sits strangely in my memory even now, happened on an ordinary Tuesday night, about 6 weeks after we moved in. Ivy and I were up in the television room a little before 8, arguing over which show to watch, when my mother called up from the kitchen that dinner was ready. We'd gotten into the habit by then of leaving the stairwell lights off on our way down, mostly because the switch was awkwardly placed at the very bottom of the top floor landing, and neither of us wanted to be the one who had to reach back through the door to flip it. So we just ran down together in the dark the way we always did, laughing about something from the show we'd been watching. We were about halfway down, right around the second floor landing where the door to my parents' floor sat closed beside us, when a voice spoke directly next to my right ear, close enough that I felt warm breath against my skin. A boy's voice, clear and a little formal in a way that didn't match any kid I actually knew, saying a single word, "Hello." Ivy and I both screamed at almost exactly the same moment and threw ourselves through the nearest door, which happened to be the second floor landing door, stumbling into the hallway outside my parents' room so fast that I clipped my shoulder hard against the doorframe. My parents came rushing out, more startled by our screaming than by anything else. And once we managed to explain what had happened, In the disjointed, overlapping, way too panicked kids explain something, my dad walked the entire staircase himself, top to bottom, checking for any kind of speaker, intercom, or vent that might have carried a voice from somewhere else in the house. He found nothing, though I remember him standing at that second-floor landing for a long moment afterward, one hand flat against the wall, before he came back upstairs to tell us it was probably nothing. My mom asked us, carefully, whether we were sure it hadn't been each other playing a joke, and Ivy and I both insisted, separately and without comparing notes first, that it had come from right next to the ear closest to the wall, meaning it couldn't have been either of us speaking to the other. That detail, that we had each independently placed the voice at our own ear rather than assuming it came from one of us, seemed to bother my dad more than he let on. He mentioned, almost offhand, that new houses sometimes had strange acoustics, air moving through unfinished wall cavities in a way that could sound almost like a voice if you were already spooked and moving fast in the dark. It was a reasonable thing to say, and for a while Ivy and I mostly let ourselves believe it, though neither of us ever raced down that staircase in the dark again without at least the phone flashlight held out in front of us. I noticed in the days right after that first night that my mom had started finding small reasons to be the one who walked down to get us for dinner instead of calling up the stairwell the way she always had, appearing at the top floor door herself most evenings rather than shouting from the kitchen. She never explained why, and I never asked, though I remember thinking at the time that it seemed like an oddly small thing for a grown woman to change her whole routine over. Over the next couple of months, the house settled into a rhythm that felt mostly normal, except for a handful of small things that individually meant nothing, but that I found myself keeping a mental list of anyway. The second floor landing. Specifically, that spot right outside my parents' door where we'd heard the voice stayed noticeably colder than the rest of the stairwell, no matter what my dad did with the heating vents, cold enough that I started avoiding lingering there even during the day. Every so often, usually in the evening, a faint smoky smell would drift through that same stretch of hallway for a minute or two, before fading completely. The kind of smell you get from a fireplace that's just been put out, though we didn't have a fireplace anywhere in the house. I mentioned the smell once to a friend from school who slept over that fall, half expecting her to think I was being dramatic, and instead she wrinkled her nose the moment we walked past that stretch of hallway together and asked, unprompted, if someone in my family smoked cigars. I told her no, and she just shrugged and said maybe it was coming from a neighbor's chimney, an explanation that made sense right up until I remembered our nearest neighbor was almost half a mile away through thick woods. Ivy started talking, sometime that autumn, about a boy she said she sometimes saw sitting on the stairs when she went down alone during the day. She described him in the plain, unbothered way kids describe imaginary friends, saying he wore old-fashioned clothes, a collared shirt buttoned all the way up, and that he never said much besides hello. The same greeting we'd both heard that first night. Though she insisted she wasn't scared of him the way I clearly was, she said he liked to sit a few steps below the second-floor landing, always in the same spot, and that he sometimes watched her walk past without saying anything at all, which she seemed to find more interesting than unsettling. She drew a picture of him once for a school art project. A small boy with dark hair and a stiff white collar, sitting cross-legged partway up a staircase that looked unmistakably like ours, right down to the uneven spacing of the bare bulbs along the wall behind him. My mother found that drawing pinned to the refrigerator one afternoon and went completely still in front of it for a long moment before asking Ivy, in a voice that had gone strangely careful, where she'd gotten the idea for the boy's clothes. It was that same evening that my mother finally told us about Daniel, sitting the two of us down at the kitchen table in a way that made it clear this wasn't a casual conversation. My dad standing quietly by the counter instead of sitting with us, as though he already knew this was a story that belonged to her to tell. She told us about the fire, about how it had started in the kitchen of the old farmhouse late one night and spread faster than anyone expected. About how Daniel, who would have been about Ivy's age at the time, hadn't made it out in time. She didn't go into much more detail than that, and I didn't ask her to. Watching her hands twist together on the table the entire time she spoke, the same restless motion I'd later recognize in myself whenever I had to talk about something I'd spent years trying not to. She said Ivy's drawing looked almost exactly like a photograph she still had somewhere of Daniel from around that same age, in a collared shirt their own mother used to make him wear for church. And she promised to dig it out for us sometime, a promise she never quite got around to keeping. I want to be clear that none of us fully believed, even after that conversation, that Ivy's imaginary friend and the voice on the stairs and Daniel were definitely the same thing. It felt like too neat a leap to make out loud, and my parents, to their credit, kept trying to find other explanations even as the coincidences piled up. My dad brought in an electrician to check the stairwell wiring a second time, thinking maybe old construction debris behind the walls was somehow amplifying sound in a strange way. The electrician found nothing unusual, though he did mention, almost as an aside, that he could smell something faintly like a chimney fire in that stretch of hallway, and couldn't figure out where it was coming from either. He spent almost an extra hour poking around the second floor landing after that, more out of his own curiosity than anything my dad was paying him for, eventually admitting he didn't have a professional explanation and suggesting, half joking, that we might want to look into the history of the property, a suggestion my dad brushed off at the time without telling him just how relevant that history actually was. The cold spot on the second floor landing grew worse as winter came on, worse than could be explained by drafts or insulation, worse than my dad's increasingly frustrated attempts to seal every gap he could find around that section of wall. Some mornings, a thin layer of fine gray ash would be sitting on the windowsill just past that landing, on the inside of the glass. In a house with no fireplace, no wood stove, nothing that should have produced ash of any kind. My mom wiped it away every time she found it without saying much, though I noticed she started keeping a small broom and dustpan tucked behind that particular window, as if she'd stopped expecting it to be a one-time thing. She never once suggested calling anyone about it. No chimney sweep, no inspector, nothing beyond that small broom, and I understood even then that some part of her had already stopped looking for an ordinary explanation. By early winter, I had started sleeping with my bedroom door shut and locked, something I'd never bothered with before we moved to Ashford, mostly because the television room between my room and Ivy's had begun to feel, some nights, like somewhere I didn't want to walk through after dark. I would sometimes hear, faintly, what sounded like a single set of footsteps crossing that room around the same time every night, slow and unhurried, stopping just outside my door before going silent again. I never worked up the nerve to open the door and check. Ivy, on the other hand, seemed almost entirely unbothered by any of it, which worried me more than if she'd been scared the way I was. She still went down to the television room some evenings by herself, and once, when I asked her directly whether the footsteps ever came into her room instead of mine, she said sometimes they did, and that she just told him to go away and he usually listened. The same casual tone she used for negotiating bedtime with our parents. I didn't know what to do with an answer like that from a 9-year-old, so mostly I just made sure her door stayed open a crack toward the hallway light instead of shut. A small compromise that let me pretend I was doing something useful. The night everything changed came in January, during a stretch of brutally cold weather that had most of the town dealing with frozen pipes and space heaters running around the clock. My parents had gone to bed early that night, both of them worn out from a long day of wrapping insulation around the exposed pipes in the crawlspace, and the house had gone unusually quiet by 10. No television running downstairs, no footsteps in the hall, nothing but the low tick of the baseboard heaters working against the cold outside. I woke sometime after 2 in the morning to a cold so total it felt like waking up outside rather than in my own bed. My breath fogging visibly in the dark. And it took me a moment to understand why I couldn't move. My whole body locked rigid the way it sometimes went in dreams where you're trying to run and your legs simply won't answer. Standing beside my bed, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him if my arm had obeyed me, was a man in a long brown overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat. The kind of clothing that looked decades out of place even by the standards of an old Vermont farming town. His face, in the thin moonlight coming through my window, didn't sit still the way a face should. It seemed to shift, subtly and constantly, between the smooth, unformed features of a young boy and the harder, older lines of a grown man, like two faces layered over each other, and neither one quite winning out. And I understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that I was looking at both Daniel and something else wearing him at the same time. Thin gray threads of smoke rose steadily from the collar and cuffs of his overcoat, curling upward into the cold air and vanishing before they reached the ceiling, though nothing about him looked like it was actually burning. The smell reached me a second later, that same faint chimney smell from the second-floor landing, except close up, it carried something underneath it too, sweeter and more unpleasant. The smell I would only recognize years afterward, from a college chemistry lab, as something close to burnt hair. I lay there, paralyzed for what felt like several minutes, my heart slamming hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, until the figure finally moved, reaching one gloved hand slowly toward my face. The moment his fingers came within an inch of my cheek, whatever had been holding my body still snapped loose all at once, and I threw myself sideways off the bed, scrambling backward until I hit my dresser, screaming for my parents at the top of my lungs, my voice cracking into something that didn't sound entirely like my own. By the time my dad got my door open, having crossed the hallway so fast he nearly took the door off its hinges, the room was empty, freezing cold, the window fogged, completely opaque on the inside despite being shut and locked. And Ivy was already standing behind him in her doorway across the television room, clutching her blanket, asking in a small voice what was wrong. My parents both assumed, understandably, that I'd experienced some kind of severe sleep paralysis episode, a condition my mom had actually dealt with herself a few times in her 20s and could describe in detail. The temporary paralysis, the vivid hallucinations, the crushing sense of another presence in the room, all classic symptoms according to everything my dad read online that same night, trying to reassure both of us. I wanted very badly to believe that explanation too, and for the first hour or so after it happened, I almost managed it. Then, my mom noticed the mark on my cheek, a thin red line running from just below my eye to the corner of my mouth, raised slightly, like the edge of a mild burn, in almost exactly the spot where that gloved hand had reached toward me. It didn't blister or peel the way an actual burn would have, but it stayed tender and faintly warm to the touch for almost 3 full days, fading slower than any scratch or friction mark should have. And my mom, who had never once had a mark like that appear on her own face during any of her sleep paralysis episodes, stopped repeating the explanation quite so confidently after that. She took a photo of it on her phone that first morning, telling me it was for the doctor in case it got worse, though we never actually made an appointment. And I found that photo still sitting in her camera roll years later when she was showing me something else entirely. The thin red line clearly visible against my 13-year-old face, undeniable in a way that memory alone might have eventually let me talk myself out of. He never came back after that night, at least not in that fully formed way. The footsteps in the television room stopped within a week or two. The cold spot on the second-floor landing eased into something closer to ordinary, drafty chill, and the ash on the windowsill appeared only once more, a thin scattering so faint my mom almost missed it, before it stopped showing up entirely. Ivy stopped mentioning the boy on the stairs around the same time, though when I asked her about it once, months later, she just shrugged and said he'd stopped visiting. The same easy, unbothered tone she'd always used for him, like a friend who'd simply moved away. We stayed in that house. My parents talked briefly about selling and starting over somewhere else entirely, but the land was paid off outright, and my mom, I think, still felt some pull toward finally making something whole out of a place that had taken so much from her, even if whole turned out to be a complicated word for what we actually had. My dad had a priest from the local parish come bless the house that same February, more for my mother's sake than out of any strong belief of his own, and though nothing about the visit felt dramatic in the moment. My mom did seem to breathe a little easier walking past the second-floor landing in the weeks after. Things stayed quiet for the most part after that January. Quiet enough that by the time I left for college 5 years later, I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing belonged more to memory than to anything still present in those walls. Ivy, who still lives at home finishing her last year of high school, told me once during a phone call that she sometimes still catches that same faint, smoky smell drifting through the upstairs hallway. Always brief. Always gone before she can be sure she actually smelled it at all, though she says it differently now. Less like something that scares her, and more like something she's simply gotten, used to living alongside. It was the spring before I left for school that my mom finally decided to deal with a stack of boxes from my grandfather's old trailer that had been sitting untouched in our basement since before we even moved in. Most of it just paperwork and old tools, nothing she'd had the stomach to go through sooner. She'd put it off for years, telling herself each time that this weekend or the next would be better, until my leaving for college seemed to finally push her into doing it, as though she wanted the house fully sorted before I was gone, and it was just her, my dad, and Ivy left in it. I helped her that weekend, mostly out of guilt for how long she'd been avoiding it alone. Both of us working mostly in silence through box after box of receipts, old tax records, and tools rusted past any real use. Most of it went straight into a donation pile or the trash without much discussion, until we got to the last box, smaller than the others and taped shut more carefully, tucked in the very back corner of the basement shelf where my dad usually kept the holiday decorations. Near the bottom of it, tucked inside a rusted tin that had once held loose nails, we found a single photograph, its edges scorched black and curling, the surface warped from heat, but not fully destroyed. It showed Daniel, unmistakably him, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing on the front steps of the old farmhouse in the same stiff white collar from Ivy's drawing, squinting slightly against sunlight that must have been decades gone by the time we found the photo. Beside him, one hand resting on his small shoulder in a way that read as gentle at first glance, and something closer to proprietary the longer I looked at it, stood a grown man in a long brown overcoat and a wide-brimmed hat, his face turned slightly away from the camera. Features blurred just enough by the old film and the fire damage that I couldn't make out anything definite about him at all. Not his age, not his expression, nothing beyond the shape of that coat and that hat, exactly as I remembered them from beside my own bed years earlier. My mother stared at that photograph for a long time without saying a word, turning it over once to check the back, where nothing was written at all. No name, no date, no note in my grandfather's handwriting to explain why he'd kept it hidden at the bottom of a tin of old nails rather than in any of the family albums upstairs. She finally set it down on the workbench between us and asked, in a voice gone very quiet, whether I recognized the man standing next to her brother. Because she was certain, absolutely certain, that she had never seen him before in her life. I was 16 when this happened, and it was the first weekend my parents had left me responsible for the house overnight. We lived in a suburb southwest of Cleveland, Ohio, in a two-story colonial at the end of a quiet street. It was not isolated. We had neighbors on both sides, another row of homes behind us, and a main road less than half a mile away. I had lived there since I was 7 and never considered it frightening. The front entrance opened into a small foyer. The living room was on the left, the dining room on the right, and the staircase went up directly ahead. A short hallway beside the stairs led into the kitchen at the back. Beyond the kitchen was a mudroom with 2 doors. One opened to the backyard. The other went into our attached 2-car garage. The basement entrance was beside the refrigerator. Upstairs, my parents had the large bedroom above the garage. My younger sister, Brooke, slept at the back of the house. My room faced the street. Across from mine was a smaller bedroom that had belonged to our older brother, Nathan. Nathan had died 8 months earlier. He was 19. His death was still sitting over our family in a way none of us knew how to talk about. He had been driving home late one Friday when he lost control of his car on a wet road and hit a concrete support near an overpass. There were no other vehicles involved. Police found no alcohol or drugs in his system. He had simply left the roadway at high speed. My parents accepted the official explanation because there was nothing else to accept. I had a harder time with it. Nathan and I had argued before he left the house that evening. The argument was stupid. He had borrowed a sweatshirt without asking. I accused him of taking everything I owned. He laughed at me. I became angrier because he wasn't taking me seriously. Eventually, he threw the sweatshirt onto my bed and said I was acting like a child. I told him I hated having him around. He walked downstairs. A few minutes later, I heard the garage door open. That was the last time I saw him alive. Nobody blamed me for what happened. I blamed myself anyway. Not because I thought the argument caused the crash in any logical sense. It was simply the final thing between us. You can have hundreds of good memories with someone, but if the last words are ugly, those words somehow become heavier than everything that came before. After Nathan died, my mother stopped going into his room unless she had to. My father wanted to clean it out after a few months. Mom refused. So the room remained almost exactly as he had left it. Bed against the far wall. Old Cleveland Browns poster above the dresser. A stack of CDs beside a cheap stereo. Shoes beneath the desk. His laundry basket still held 2 shirts that had never been washed. I rarely opened the door. That weekend, my parents were attending a wedding near Columbus and planned to stay overnight at a hotel. They almost asked my aunt to stay with us, but I convinced them that was unnecessary. I had my license, I had a phone, we had good neighbors. Brooke was 13, not 5. I promised we would stay home, order pizza, watch movies, and cause no trouble. That promise lasted about 3 hours. Brooke's friend Jenna came over shortly after my parents left. By early evening, the 2 of them were bored. They wanted snacks from a particular store downtown and kept asking if we could drive around for a while. I said no several times. Then I gave in. Part of it was wanting to feel older than 16. Part of it was that I hated how cautious everyone had become after Nathan died. My parents wanted to know where I was constantly. My father inspected my tires before I drove anywhere. Mom called if I was 10 minutes late. I understood why. I also wanted one evening where everything felt normal. We left shortly after 7. I was driving Nathan's old car. That was another thing my mother initially hated. It was a dark blue Honda Accord, almost 10 years old by then. Dad had planned to sell it after the accident investigation ended. But the damage was mostly cosmetic, and insurance had paid for repairs. I needed a vehicle for school and work. Eventually, my parents let me have it. The driver's door still had a faint scratch near the handle that the body shop never fully removed. Nathan had also stuck a small silver medal inside the center console. It showed St. Christopher carrying a child. He was not especially religious. One of our grandmothers gave it to him when he started driving. I kept it there. We reached downtown without any trouble. It was a chilly Saturday night in early spring, busy enough that I never felt unsafe. We drove around, stopped for drinks and snacks, then headed back toward the highway. I don't remember the exact intersection where we saw him. I know we were stopped at a long red light near an area with older commercial buildings, parking lots, and several lanes of traffic. There were maybe 6 cars around us. A gray sedan sat 2 vehicles ahead in our lane. Without warning, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. At first I assumed he'd dropped something or had a problem with his car. Then he ran toward the vehicle beside him and hit both palms against its passenger window. The driver jerked away. The stranger laughed. I could not hear it clearly through my closed windows, but I saw his shoulders moving. He jumped onto the hood. Actually, jumped onto it. The person inside started leaning on the horn. Brooke said, "What is he doing?" I told both girls to lock their doors. The automatic locks were already engaged, but I pressed the button again. The guy slid off that first car and ran toward another. He grabbed its side mirror and shook it hard enough that I thought it would break. The driver pulled forward as far as traffic allowed. Everyone around us began using their horns. The strangers seemed excited by the noise. He slapped the roof of a pickup. Then he climbed halfway onto the trunk of the car, directly in front of mine. That was when I saw his face. He wore some kind of homemade covering. I hesitate to call it a normal mask because it did not cover everything. A yellow-brown piece of stiff material wrapped around the lower left side of his face, beginning near his temple and continuing across his cheek, mouth, and jaw. It looked like old leather. There were narrow black cords stitched through it in parallel lines. Instead of a normal opening over the mouth, there was a small oval cut too far to one side. Through that opening, I could see part of his teeth, even though his lips were not moving. The right side of his face was exposed. He looked maybe 40. Short hair. Ordinary skin. No beard. The covered side made the entire head look slightly crooked. He turned toward us. Brooke swore. Jenna grabbed the back of my seat. The strangers stepped down from the car ahead. For a second, he simply looked at me. Then he started walking toward our hood. There was nowhere for me to reverse. A minivan was directly behind us. Cars filled the next lane. To my right was a raised curb and a wide sidewalk. I put both hands on the wheel. If he comes closer, I'm going over the curb. Brooke said, "What?" I'm serious. The light was still red. He came within one car length. His gaze moved across the windshield. Then he stopped. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring lower, at the dashboard. I followed his eyes. The center console was partly open. Nathan's St. Christopher medal was visible inside. The expression on the exposed half of the stranger's face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. That frightened me more than the running and shouting. His head tilted. One hand rose slowly. The fingertips touched the leather near his jaw. He pressed them there as though checking something underneath. Then the traffic signal changed. Every driver reacted at once. Cars surged forward. Horns blared. The vehicle ahead of me moved several feet, nearly clipping him. The masked stranger jumped back. I accelerated hard, went through the intersection, and made the first legal turn I could. Brooke kept asking whether he was following us. I checked my mirrors constantly. The gray sedan disappeared behind several other cars. I didn't care. I took side streets until I could turn around completely and head home. Nobody wanted snacks anymore. Jenna kept saying the same thing in different ways. That was insane. Why was he doing that? Did you see his face? Brooke asked why he had stared into our car. I told her he probably hadn't. That was a lie. He had looked directly at something inside. I could still see the exposed side of his mouth tightening after he noticed the console. My hands shook the entire drive back. When we reached our neighborhood, I started feeling embarrassed. Nothing had actually happened to us. He had not touched the car. He had not followed. There were dozens of witnesses. The incident probably involved someone high, drunk, mentally ill, or trying to get arrested. I did not call my parents. That was partly because I knew the first question would be why we were downtown after I promised to stay home. We pulled into the garage at 8:46. I remember the time because the dashboard clock was 5 minutes fast, and Brooke corrected it. The overhead door closed behind us. I waited until it reached the floor. Then we went inside through the mudroom. I locked that entrance. Brooke teased me. "You think he's in the garage?" No, you checked it twice. I always check it. You absolutely don't. Jenna told her to stop. We moved into the kitchen. I tried to act normal. We made popcorn. The girls went downstairs to the finished basement and turned on a movie. I stayed upstairs for a few minutes because I wanted to call one of my friends. Instead, I stood at the kitchen sink looking into the backyard. Our rear floodlight was off. Everything beyond the glass looked ordinary. A wooden fence ran across the back of the property. The gate was on the left near the garage wall. My dad kept a small shed in the far corner. Nothing moved. I finally went downstairs. The basement was divided into two areas. The finished half had carpet, an old couch, television, and game system. The unfinished section was beyond a door near the laundry machines. Dad kept tools and storage boxes there. We had barely restarted the movie when we heard a car outside. Not unusual. Our street had traffic. This one sounded different because the engine remained nearby. It slowed, then idled. Brooke muted the television. You think that's him? No, how do you know? Because we live 20 minutes away. The engine continued. I went upstairs. The front curtains were open a few inches. I looked through the gap. No vehicle sat directly outside our house. At the far end of the street, headlights moved through the intersection. The idling noise stopped. I told myself we had heard one of the neighbors. When I returned downstairs, Jenna was staring toward the small basement window. What? I thought somebody walked past. The window was high on the wall. All you could see from inside was a strip of the front lawn and part of the driveway. Probably a neighbor. Right next to the house? I went over. Nothing. I closed the blind. We turned the movie back on. About 15 minutes later, the landline rang upstairs. None of us moved at first. Then, Brooke looked at me. Are you getting that? I went up. The phone sat on the kitchen wall beside the refrigerator. Caller ID showed out of area. I answered. Hello? No voice. There was background noise. A steady rushing sound. I thought maybe the call had come from a cell phone inside a moving car. Hello? Something clicked. Then I heard a turn signal. The slow electronic sound came 3 times. Click, pause, click, pause, click. The call ended. I stood holding the receiver. It could have been a wrong number. It probably was. I hung up. When I turned around, the mudroom door was open. Not the exterior door, the one between the kitchen and mudroom. I had left it closed. I walked over. The outside entrance to the backyard remained locked. The garage door was also shut. Nothing looked wrong. Then I noticed the floor. There was a dark smear on the tile near the garage threshold. Grease. I touched it with one finger. It smelled like motor oil. Dad kept supplies in the garage, so that was hardly impossible. Still, I had cleaned the mudroom earlier that day. I would have noticed the mark. I wiped it up with a paper towel and locked the garage entrance again. Before returning downstairs, I looked through the small window in the mudroom. Nathan's Accord sat exactly where I had parked it. Something on the driver's side glass caught the overhead light. A handprint. A full print on the outside of the window. I froze. We had been inside less than half an hour. The stranger downtown had never touched our car. At least I had not seen him do it. I opened the mudroom door but did not enter the garage. From where I stood, I could see the print more clearly. The palm was oily. 4 fingers pointed upward. The thumb angled toward the rear of the car. I called Brooke. She came up with Jenna. I asked if either of them had touched the window after we parked. Both said no. Jenna immediately wanted to call her mother. That was when I finally told them we should contact mine first. Mom answered from the hotel. I did not give her every detail. I said a strange person had approached cars downtown, and I thought someone might have touched our vehicle afterward. There was a long silence. You went downtown? I know. I told you not to. I know. My father took the phone. His response was more practical. Are the doors locked? Yes, garage? Yes. Back gate? I don't know. Don't go check it. That surprised me. Dad told me to turn on the exterior lights and stay inside. He said if we saw anyone in the yard or heard someone trying a door, call police immediately. Mom wanted to drive home. It would take nearly 2 hours. I said there was no reason. At that point, even I thought we were overreacting. The handprint could have been old. The call could have been random. Someone driving slowly through the neighborhood meant nothing. We stayed upstairs after that. Jenna's mother offered to pick her up, but Dad said he would rather nobody come and go until we were sure things were fine. The three of us settled in the living room. I turned on the porch lamp and backyard floodlight. For a while, everything felt calmer. We ate the popcorn. We watched television. Brooke texted friends. Jenna eventually laughed about the downtown incident and said we would probably turn it into a story at school. At 10:12, the backyard floodlight went out. I noticed because the kitchen window suddenly turned black. I walked over and flipped the switch. Nothing. The bulb had been working 20 minutes earlier. Burned out, Brooke said. Probably I hated that the word sounded hopeful. The front porch lamp remained on. I checked every downstairs lock again. The backyard door, garage entrance, front deadbolt, living room windows, dining room windows, all secure. When I came back through the foyer, something upstairs was different. Nathan's bedroom door stood open, only a few inches. I stopped at the bottom of the staircase. That room was always closed, not locked, just shut. I was sure it had been closed when my parents left. Brooke came beside me. Did you go in there? No, maybe Mom left it like that. I didn't answer. The hallway above was dark. I turned on the stairlight. The bedroom door remained slightly open. I went up. Brooke and Jenna followed, even though I told them to stay downstairs. The room smelled exactly the way I remembered. Dust, old deodorant, the faint rubber smell from sneakers. I pushed the door farther. Nothing had been disturbed. The bed was made, curtains shut, desk chair tucked in. Then Jenna pointed at the dresser. Was that picture like that? A framed photograph of Nathan and me lay face down. It normally stood near the stereo. I knew because my mother dusted around it without moving anything else. I picked it up. The glass was cracked. A thin fracture ran across Nathan's face. Brooke said, Emily, I don't like this. Neither did I. I set the frame upright. Underneath it was something I had never seen before. A narrow piece of dartcord, maybe 3 inches long, stiff, waxed. It looked like the same kind of black stitching I'd seen running through the stranger's facial covering. I did not say that. I put it on the dresser. Then we heard the garage door opener. All three of us stopped. The electric motor started below. A heavy mechanical rumble passed through the house. The overhead garage door was opening. I ran downstairs. The girls followed. By the time I reached the mudroom, the motor had stopped. I looked through the window. The garage door was raised about 2 feet. Cold air moved underneath it. No car was outside. I pressed the wall button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. Still nothing. Brooke whispered, Don't go out there. I won't. I locked the mudroom door. Then we heard something scrape across the garage floor. Not near our car. Closer to the raised opening. A slow dragging sound. It moved several feet, then stopped. I called 911. This time, I did not hesitate. I told the dispatcher someone might be in our garage. She asked whether we could safely leave the house. I looked toward the front. Yes, She told us to go to a neighbor's home if we could do so without moving toward the possible intruder. We grabbed our shoes. I had just unlocked the front deadbolt when the porch light went out. The foyer became much darker. Brooke said my name. The front handle moved, not violently. Someone pressed it down from outside. I stepped backward. The dispatcher was still on the phone. Someone's at the front door. She told us not to open it. The handle returned to position. Then the doorbell rang. One normal chime. None of us breathed. Another came several seconds later. Jenna started crying. The third time, the person outside held the button down. The chime repeated through the house. I pulled the girls away from the entrance. Upstairs, the dispatcher heard me. She asked where we were going. I told her the upstairs bedrooms had locks. That was not completely true. My parents' room did. So did the bathroom. Nathan's door had an old slide bolt on the inside because he'd installed it when he was 15 and obsessed with privacy. Dad had threatened to remove it, but never did. We started up the stairs. Before we reached the top, something hit the garage mudroom door. The sound came from the back of the house. A second impact followed. Wood cracked. The intruder was no longer outside the front. That was impossible. There was no way to get from the porch to the garage that quickly without running around the entire house. Unless there were two people. The dispatcher told me officers were close. I pushed Brooke and Jenna toward my parents' bedroom. Then I heard the mudroom door break. The lower floor filled with a sharp splintering noise. Brooke grabbed my arm. He's inside. I told the dispatcher. She said to lock ourselves in a room and stay away from windows. My parents' bedroom was closest. I pushed both girls inside. Then I looked down the staircase. A figure crossed the kitchen hallway. Brown jacket, dark pants, yellowed leather covering part of his face. I recognized him immediately. He looked up. The exposed eye found mine. Then he started toward the stairs. I slammed my parents' door. The lock was a small button built into the knob. I pressed it. We pushed a dresser against the door. It was heavy. The three of us managed to move it maybe 18 inches, enough to block part of the entrance. The dispatcher kept asking questions. Was he armed? I hadn't seen a weapon. Was anyone injured? Not yet. Could we get out through a window? My parents' bedroom was above the garage. The drop to the driveway would have been enough to break a leg. I told her no. Footsteps reached the landing. The stranger stopped outside. Nobody spoke. Then something lightly touched the door. Not a knock, more like fingernails sliding across the wood. The contact moved from the top panel downward. Jenna covered her mouth. Brooke whispered, "What does he want?" I had no answer. The doorknob turned. The lock held. He tried again, then stopped. For several seconds, there was nothing. I began hoping he'd gone. A hard strike hit the door beside the latch. The dresser jumped. Jenna screamed. Another blow damaged the frame. I realized the bedroom door was hollow. It was not going to hold. I looked around for something we could use. My father kept no gun in the room. There was a heavy lamp, a wooden chair. Nothing that made me feel safer. Then I remembered Nathan's room. His old aluminum baseball bat was in the closet. He had played in a summer league. After he quit, the bat stayed leaning behind his jackets for years. It was across the hall, maybe 6 feet away. Getting to it meant opening our door. I had no intention of doing that. Then the stranger hit the door again. The frame split. A narrow line of hallway became visible. I could see part of the brown jacket. We needed another plan. My parents' bathroom connected to their bedroom, but it had no second exit. The window above the tub faced the backyard, and was smaller than the bedroom windows. There was no safe way down. I told Brooke to lock herself and Jenna in the bathroom if the bedroom door failed. "What about you?" "I'll be right there." Another strike shook the dresser. I don't remember deciding to leave. I simply knew that if we stayed together in that room, he would eventually get through, and we'd have nothing but a lamp. I picked up the wooden chair. I told the dispatcher what I was about to do. She said not to confront him unless absolutely necessary. I said it was necessary. Brooke called me an idiot. She was crying. I told her to lock the bathroom door after I left. Then I pulled the dresser back just enough to reach the knob. The damaged door opened inward. I yanked it suddenly and shoved the chair through the gap. It hit the stranger in the chest. He stumbled backward. I ran. Nathan's room was directly across the hall. I got inside and slammed the door. The slide bolt stuck at first. I forced it across. My hands were shaking so badly I almost missed the metal catch. The room smelled stronger than before. I opened the closet. The bat was there. I grabbed it. The stranger reached the hallway outside. His footsteps were slower now. He stopped beyond the door. I held the bat with both hands. My entire body trembled. For the first time since Nathan died, I looked around his bedroom and felt something other than guilt. I remembered sitting on the floor while he taught me how to hold a bat properly. I remembered him mocking me because I kept closing my eyes before swinging. I remembered the way he used to stand behind me and move my elbows. "Watch what you're hitting," he'd say. I had not thought about that in years. The stranger pressed against the door. The bolt shifted. I tightened my grip. The frame groaned. Then his fingers appeared around the edge. He had found the gap where the wood had warped. The hand looked human. Dirty nails, red knuckles, no gloves. He reached inside blindly. I swung. The bat struck his forearm. He pulled back. A low sound came from the hallway. Not a scream, more like an animal exhaling after being hit. Then the door slammed inward. The bolt tore free from the old wood. I backed toward the bed. The stranger entered. Up close, the covering on his face looked worse. The leather was cracked and darkened in places, as though it had been wet many times and allowed to dry. The black cords passed through small holes along the cheek. Near the jaw, one section had torn loose. Behind it was not skin. I saw another layer of the same yellow-brown material underneath, folded, like the face covering continued beneath itself. He stepped forward. I raised the bat. "Stay back." My voice barely worked. The exposed side of his mouth moved. He said one word, "Nate." I stopped breathing. Nobody called my brother that except family and close friends. I had not said his name downtown. Neither had Brooke or Jenna. The stranger touched the side of his own face. One of the black cords had loosened where I'd struck him. He pulled at it. The lower section opened slightly. Inside the oval mouth hole, I could see teeth again. Too many of them. Not rows of monster teeth. Nothing like that. Just several human-looking teeth positioned where they should not have fit, continuing farther toward the cheek. I swung the bat. He caught it. The impact made my palms sting. For a second, we both held the barrel. Then, he pulled. I lost my grip. The bat hit the floor. The stranger grabbed my sweatshirt and shoved me against the wall. My shoulders struck Nathan's poster frame. Glass cracked behind me. I screamed. He dragged me toward the doorway. I kicked at his knee. My foot connected. He stumbled. I grabbed the dresser. He pulled harder. The collar tightened around my throat. I could hear Brooke screaming from my parents' room. The stranger kept trying to move me into the hall. I had no idea why. I reached behind me blindly and found something on the dresser. Nathan's framed photograph. The cracked one. I hit the stranger's face with it. The glass shattered. He released me. A piece of the leather covering tore near the jaw. A strip fell onto the carpet. For the first time, he reacted with obvious pain. He covered that side with one hand. I picked up the bat. He lunged. I swung with everything I had. The aluminum hit his shoulder. He crashed into the desk. The cheap wooden chair broke underneath him. I ran into the hallway. Brooke had opened the bathroom door. I screamed at her to stay inside. The stranger came out behind me. I reached the top of the stairs. He grabbed the back of my shirt. I fell forward. My knees hit the carpet. He pulled me away from the staircase. I turned and struck his hand with the bat. His fingers opened. Then, Jenna appeared. She had taken the heavy ceramic toilet tank lid from the bathroom. I still don't know how she lifted it comfortably. She threw it. It hit the stranger's upper arm and shattered against the wall. He stepped back. Brooke grabbed my wrist. We ran down the stairs together. The intruder followed. The three of us reached the foyer. I tried the front door. The deadbolt turned, the door moved an inch and stopped. Something had been wedged underneath from the porch side. I pulled. Nothing. The stranger reached the bottom stair. I saw the living room window. It was one of the older double-hung windows, large enough to climb through. I grabbed a dining chair and hit the lower pane. The first swing cracked it. The second broke the glass. Brooke started knocking pieces out with the bat. The stranger crossed the foyer. I turned to face him. That was the first time I saw the exposed half of his face clearly beneath the brighter living room lamp. He looked familiar. Not like Nathan. Not exactly like anyone I knew. The familiarity came from one small feature, a thin scar through the right eyebrow. Nathan had the same scar. He got it when we were kids after falling from a bike. My stomach turned. The stranger touched his eyebrow as if he saw where I was looking. Then he smiled. I screamed at him to stay away. He moved faster. I swung the chair. He caught one leg and ripped it from my hands. Then he grabbed my forearm. Pain shot from my wrist to my elbow. His fingers dug in hard enough that I knew there would be bruises. He pulled me toward him. The damaged piece of leather hung from his jaw. The black stitching stretched. Something underneath shifted against it. I smelled wet pavement and old engine oil. Brooke struck him across the back with the bat. His grip loosened. I tore free. Jenna had cleared enough glass from the living room window. She climbed out first. Brooke followed. I went last. The stranger caught the back of my jeans as I climbed over the sill. For 1 second, I was stuck halfway through. My hands were outside on the wet grass. My legs remained inside. He pulled. I kicked backward. My shoe hit something hard. The grip disappeared. I fell into the front bushes. Brooke and Jenna dragged me up. We ran barefoot and half-dressed across our neighbor's lawn. The police arrived before we reached the next porch. 2 cruisers came from opposite ends of the street. Officers entered our house immediately. They searched every room. Nobody was inside. The garage was empty except for our cars and normal storage. The overhead door was still raised about 2 feet. The side gate remained latched from inside. The backyard fence had no obvious damage. The front door was blocked by a narrow piece of wood jammed under the threshold from the porch. Police found it immediately. The mudroom entrance was broken. The upper hinge had partly separated from the frame. The latch plate was bent. There were shoe marks on the kitchen tile. There was blood on the carpet in Nathan's room. Not much. Several dark drops near the broken chair. The aluminum bat had a reddish smear along one side. My sweatshirt was torn. 5 bruises formed around my forearm by morning. One officer photographed them. Jenna had a shallow cut across her palm from the broken window. Brooke had bruised her shoulder climbing outside. The police collected the strip that had torn from the stranger's facial covering. It was about 4 inches long, yellowed leather, or something, very similar. Several lengths of black cord remained threaded through the edge. An officer placed it into an evidence bag. They also photographed the greasy handprint on my car. It was still there. That mattered to me. I had spent most of the night wondering whether fear had changed my memory. The print was real. The broken doors were real. The blood was real. The bruises stayed for more than a week. My parents came home before sunrise. Mom was furious for about 5 minutes. Then, she saw my arm. After that, she just held me. Dad walked through the house with one of the officers. He kept asking how anyone could have entered the garage. Nobody had a good answer. The overhead door could have been forced upward slightly, but it would have been difficult to crawl underneath without leaving marks along the dirty concrete. There were no footprints leading from the driveway into the garage. Rain had started shortly after midnight. The driveway was wet enough that shoes should have tracked something. Inside, the only marks began several feet from the overhead opening. The police treated it as a home invasion. They also took information about the incident downtown. I described the gray sedan as well as I could. I never got a license plate. Neither did Brooke. Jenna thought it might have started with an H, but she wasn't sure. We later learned officers had responded to several calls about a man harassing drivers that night. By the time police reached the intersection, he was gone. Nobody was arrested. I refused to drive Nathan's car for months. Dad eventually sold it. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. The final part happened the next afternoon. Most of us had barely slept. Jenna's parents had picked her up in the morning. Brooke was on the couch with Mom. Dad was repairing a temporary board over the broken living room window. I went upstairs because I wanted to get clean clothes. Nathan's bedroom door was open. The police had left it that way after searching. I stood in the hallway for a long time. Then I went inside. The room looked awful. Broken glass near the wall. Desk chair smashed. One corner of the poster frame hanging loose. The carpet still showed a faint dark spot where the stranger had bled. I sat on Nathan's bed. For months I had avoided being in that room because it made me remember our last argument. That afternoon, I remembered different things. Him teaching me to bat. Him letting me drive around an empty parking lot before I had a permit. Him making grilled cheese at midnight. The normal stuff. I started crying. Not because I thought the stranger had been Nathan. I didn't. Whatever had entered our house had used his name, his scar, and something connected to his car. That made me angry in a different way. It felt like an invasion of something that belonged to my family. Mom came upstairs a few minutes later. She sat beside me. I told her what the stranger had said. Nate, I told her about the scar. Her face changed. Which eyebrow? The right. She stood. For a moment, I thought she was going to leave. Instead, she opened Nathan's closet. On the upper shelf were several boxes my parents had brought home from the police station after his accident. I had never looked through them. Mom pulled down a white cardboard property box. Dad came upstairs while she was opening it. He asked what she was doing. She said, "I need to check something." Inside were Nathan's wallet, broken sunglasses, house keys, a damaged phone, loose coins, and several pieces of clothing. There was also a sealed, clear evidence bag. Mom picked it up. The color drained from her face. Dad took it from her. Inside the bag was a narrow strip of yellow-brown leather threaded with black cord. It looked almost identical to the piece police had collected from our carpet. I asked what it was. Neither of my parents answered at first. Dad read the label. He looked at Mom. Then, at me. The item had been recovered from the inside of Nathan's car after the crash. According to the evidence tag, it was found caught beneath the driver's seat. My mother whispered. We thought it came off his shoe. Nathan had not been wearing anything made of leather that night. I picked up the bag. There was a dark stain along one edge. 3 little holes ran through the material. Black cord remained knotted through 2 of them. Dad told me to put it down. Then I noticed something written on the back of the evidence label. Not printed. Handwritten, a short note from whoever processed the car. Possible foreign material. Driver's side. Under that was the date. 8 months before, I saw the same thing covering a stranger's face in downtown Cleveland. I was 26 when my father died, and for almost a year afterward, I kept having the same problem whenever I dreamed about him. He would be there, but I could never reach him. Sometimes I would see him crossing a parking lot. Other nights, he would be sitting at the far end of a restaurant, or standing behind a crowd at a baseball game, or walking through our old backyard with his hands in his pockets. Every time I noticed him, I would start moving in his direction, and every time something would get in the way. A doorway would close. The crowd would thicken. The ground would stretch. I would wake before I could speak. That bothered me because the last real conversation we had ended badly. Dad and I had always been close when I was young, but the relationship became harder after my mother left. He never remarried, and over the years he turned into the kind of person who called for help with things he could probably have handled himself. A leaking faucet, a computer problem, a doctor's appointment he wanted company for. At first I didn't mind. Later, when work became busier and I moved farther away, I started treating his calls like obligations. The final argument happened on a Wednesday evening. He rang while I was finishing a report from home. He sounded tired and asked if I could come over that weekend because he had been feeling strange at night. I assumed he meant physically unwell. I asked whether he had called his doctor. He said, "It isn't that." I wanted him to explain, but he kept circling around the subject. He mentioned waking suddenly, hearing someone in the upstairs hall, and feeling as if the house was different after midnight. I remember getting impatient. He had been sleeping badly for months. He was drinking too much coffee. He watched television until 2 in the morning. Every sensible explanation seemed more likely than whatever he was trying to describe. Eventually I said, "You need sleep, not me driving 3 hours because the house creaks." There was a long silence. Then he replied, "Fine, forget I called." I told him not to be dramatic. That was the last thing I ever said to him. He died 2 nights later from a massive heart attack in the basement. A neighbor found him Saturday morning after noticing the garage light had been on all night. There was no mysterious medical explanation. He had heart disease. He had ignored symptoms. The coroner believed he died quickly. None of that made the final phone call easier to live with. For months, I kept thinking about the part I had dismissed, someone in the upstairs hall. I knew grief was probably making it seem more important than it had been. My father had been tired and frightened. People say odd things when they aren't sleeping well. Still, once he was gone, I wished I had asked one more question. After the funeral, the house sat mostly empty. It was a 2-story place in a small town in western Pennsylvania, built in the late 1960s. I grew up there, so I knew every part of it. The front entrance opened into a narrow foyer. The living room was on the left. Straight ahead was a hallway leading to the kitchen. The dining room sat between those 2 spaces, and a small mudroom off the kitchen connected to the garage. The staircase began beside the foyer wall and rose to a landing before turning right. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. My childhood room was at the front, above the living room. Dad's room was at the back, overlooking the yard. Between them was a smaller room he had turned into an office after I moved out. The bathroom was across from the office. The basement entrance was in the kitchen. Those stairs led down to a finished rec room on one side and Dad's workshop on the other. The furnace and water heater were behind a louvered utility door near the back wall. He had died beside the workbench. I avoided that part of the basement whenever possible. By the following summer, I had no choice but to deal with the property. Keeping an empty house was costing money, and my aunt, who lived nearby, kept reminding me that Dad would have hated seeing it sit unused. So I took 3 weeks off work and moved into my old bedroom while I cleared everything out. The first few nights were difficult. Not frightening, just sad. The house smelled like him. Coffee, laundry detergent, sawdust from the basement. The faint mint smell of the muscle rub he used on his shoulder. Small objects kept surprising me. His reading glasses beside the recliner. A grocery list stuck to the refrigerator. Half a bag of birdseed in the mudroom. I slept badly. That was how I ended up reading about lucid dreaming. I had searched online for ways to remember dreams more clearly. From there, I found discussions about becoming aware while dreaming and even directing what happened. Most techniques sounded like they required weeks of keeping journals, checking clocks, or waking yourself during the night. I didn't have the patience. Then, I came across a shortcut people claimed could work faster. The basic idea was simple. Lie completely still. Do not scratch. Do not shift your legs. Do not roll over. Ignore every small urge to move. Eventually, according to what I read, the body might fall asleep while the mind remained aware. Some people described a heavy feeling, buzzing, strange noises, or temporary paralysis before entering a dream. I knew what sleep paralysis was. I'd never experienced it, but I understood the general explanation. The brain wakes before the body fully comes out of REM sleep, so for a short period you may be conscious without being able to move. That should have discouraged me. Instead, I focused on the possibility of controlling a dream. I had one goal. I wanted to see Dad and know I was dreaming. I wanted enough awareness to say what I had not said while he was alive. I am sorry. That was it. I wasn't trying to contact the dead. I didn't believe I could actually speak to him. I wanted my own brain to give me a version of him long enough to finish the conversation. The first night I tried, nothing happened. I lay flat on my back in my childhood bed with my arms beside me. Within 5 minutes, my nose itched. Then, my left foot felt uncomfortable. Then, I became aware of every place my body touched the mattress. After about 15 minutes, I gave up. The next evening, I tried again. This time, I made it farther. At some point, my arms began feeling heavy. My breathing seemed louder than usual. I had the odd sensation that my hands were no longer positioned exactly where I knew they were. Then, a car drove past outside and broke my concentration. I rolled over and went to sleep normally. On the third night, I almost didn't bother. I had spent the day sorting boxes from the office. I was exhausted. My back hurt, and I had dust in my hair from pulling things off shelves. Before bed, I found one of Dad's old cassette recorders in a desk drawer. There was a tape inside. I pressed play. Most of it was blank. Then, I heard his voice. He had apparently used the recorder years earlier to make notes while working on something in the basement. The words were ordinary. Measurements. A reminder to buy screws. Something about replacing a hinge. Hearing him unexpectedly hit me harder than I expected. I sat on the office floor for several minutes with the recorder in my hands. That night, I wanted the lucid dream more than before. I showered, turned off the lights, and lay on my back. The bedroom door was closed but not locked. I never locked it because there was no reason to. The hallway light was off. Only a little orange glow from a street lamp came through the curtains. I checked the clock before starting. 12:41 a.m. I placed my arms at my sides. Then I stopped moving. At first, it was exactly like the other attempts. My face itched. One knee wanted to bend. My tongue felt too large inside my mouth. I ignored everything. After what I guessed was 20 minutes, those sensations faded. My body became extremely heavy. Not numb. I could still feel the mattress under me, but moving no longer seemed natural. My breathing slowed. A low electrical hum developed somewhere in my hearing. I remember thinking, this might actually work. Then I heard the floorboard outside my room. There was one board halfway between the bathroom and the stairs that had squeaked for as long as I could remember. It made a short complaining sound whenever someone stepped near the wall. That night, it creaked. I opened my eyes. The bedroom remained dark. I told myself the house was settling. Several seconds later, another board reacted closer to my doorway. I wanted to sit up. Nothing happened. I tried raising my head. My neck stayed flat against the pillow. That was when I realized I had reached the paralysis stage. Oddly, I wasn't terrified yet. I knew this could happen. I had read about it. My brain was awake while my body was still asleep. The footsteps were probably part of the same process. Then the brass handle on my bedroom door moved. Very slowly, it lowered halfway. Stopped, returned to its original position. I stared at it. My heart began pounding. I tried to speak. No sound came out. The handle dipped again. This time it went all the way down. The latch clicked inside the frame. The door moved inward, perhaps half an inch, then stopped. I tried moving my fingers. Nothing, my toes. Nothing. I couldn't even turn my head. The handle rose. For several seconds, there was silence. Then someone pressed it again. Faster, the door shook lightly against the frame. My breathing became shallow. I tried to remind myself that hallucinations during sleep paralysis can involve sounds, people, pressure, even movement in the environment. I repeated that explanation inside my head. This isn't real. Your brain is doing this. The next attempt was stronger. The handle went down sharply several times in a row. The frame gave a dry rattle. Whoever was outside was no longer casually checking the room. They were trying to get in. Fear changed into something else. I became furious. I don't mean normal anger. It was immediate and overwhelming. The rage came so hard that for a moment it was stronger than panic. I remember thinking, you are not coming into this room. Then another thought followed. Get up. I concentrated on my right hand. Nothing. I focused harder. My index finger moved. Barely. Then, my whole hand jerked. The paralysis released all at once. I sat upright so violently that pain shot through my lower back. The handle moved again. I yelled. I don't remember exactly what I said. Something like, come on then. I jumped out of bed. The door flew open when I grabbed it. The hallway was empty. I charged toward the stairs anyway. I was so angry that I did not feel frightened for several seconds. I checked the bathroom. Empty. The office. Empty. Dad's bedroom. Nothing. I went downstairs without even putting on shoes. The living room was dark. Kitchen empty. Mudroom locked. Front entrance secure. The garage door was down. No windows open. By the time I reached the basement entrance, the anger had disappeared. I stood in the kitchen looking at that door. The workshop was below me, the place where Dad died. I had no intention of going down there at 1 in the morning. I turned on every light downstairs instead. Then I checked the front and back locks twice. Eventually, I returned to my bedroom. The handle worked normally. The frame wasn't damaged. I sat on the bed until sunrise. By morning, the whole experience seemed easier to explain. I had deliberately attempted a method known to produce sleep paralysis. Then I experienced classic symptoms: inability to move, trouble speaking, a threatening presence, sounds near the bed. Once I broke the paralysis, the hallucination ended. That was the rational answer. I accepted it. I stopped trying to lucid dream. For 2 nights, nothing happened. On the 3rd morning, my Aunt Denise came over to help sort clothes for donation. She lived about 15 minutes away and had been checking on me every few days. We were carrying boxes down from Dad's room when she noticed my bedroom frame. "What did you do there?" I looked. 3 shallow dents had appeared in the painted wood beside the latch. They were small, square rather than round. Each one was maybe a 1/4 inch across. I touched them. The paint around the edges had chipped. I don't know. She gave me a look. "Moving furniture?" "No, something hit it." I thought about the night of the paralysis. I did not tell her. Instead, I said I must have banged a box against it. That explanation bothered me because the marks were on the hallway side. I had not carried anything large enough upstairs. Still, there were countless ordinary ways wood could get damaged. I photographed the frame, mostly because I had started documenting repairs before listing the house. The next strange incident happened during daylight. I was in Dad's office, going through paperwork. The bedroom door across the hall was open. At around 4 in the afternoon, I heard a tiny hard contact against the wall. I looked up. Nothing. A few seconds later, another little sound came from the hallway. Then another. Not a rhythm, more like someone testing different surfaces with a small wooden object. I stepped into the hall. Silence. I checked the bathroom, because old plumbing can create all kinds of noises. The sink was dry. No pipes were moving. As I turned back, I noticed a mark on the bathroom door. 1 square depression. Same size as the damage beside my bedroom latch. I stared at it. The paint inside the mark looked fresh. I went downstairs and called Denise. She came over after dinner. I showed her both locations. This time I told her about the paralysis episode. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You scared yourself." "I know. That sleeping trick sounds like a terrible idea." "I know." She looked at the square marks again. "These could be from anything." That's what I thought. "You're tired. You're alone in your dad's house. Everything is going to feel bigger than it is." I agreed. She offered to stay. I told her no, partly because I believed she was right, partly because I was embarrassed. After she left, I moved a dining chair upstairs and wedged it beneath my bedroom handle. I told myself it was to stop the door shifting in the frame. That night I slept on my side. I didn't lie flat. Nothing happened. A week passed. I became more comfortable again. The estate agent visited. A contractor repaired a gutter. I filled a rented dumpster with old furniture and boxes. Normal activity made the house feel like a building instead of a memory. Then I found Dad's notebook. It was in the basement workshop. I had finally forced myself to clear that area because the workbench needed to be emptied before the house could be photographed. Dad kept several cheap spiral notebooks on a shelf. Most contained project measurements, receipts, and lists. One had writing only in the final dozen pages. The first odd entry was dated 3 months before his death. He had written, "Woke 2:16. Hall again. Stayed still. Mistake, a few pages later, bedroom handle. 4 times. Didn't open. Then, sleeping on side seems better." My hands started shaking. I sat on the workshop stool and read every page. There was no explanation of who or what he thought was in the house. He never used the word ghost. He never described a person. The notes became shorter over time. He wrote about hearing movement when lying flat. He mentioned waking unable to speak. He wrote that anger breaks it faster than fear. One line made me feel sick. It said, "If you get up angry, don't follow it downstairs." I closed the notebook. For several minutes, I just sat there. Dad's final phone call returned to me. Someone in the upstairs hall. He had not been talking about pipes. He had not been talking about insomnia in some vague way. He had experienced the same thing. At least something similar enough that I could no longer comfortably call mine a random hallucination. I called Denise. She came over immediately. We read the pages together. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your father had sleep problems. Did he ever tell you?" "No. Anything about hearing someone?" "No." I asked whether mental illness ran in the family. She became irritated. "Not that I know of." "Then what is this?" "I don't know." We agreed that I would stay at her place that night. Before leaving, I carried the notebook upstairs. I placed it on the kitchen table while I packed a bag. As I came down from my bedroom, I heard something from the mudroom. A dry little click. Then another. I stopped halfway through the kitchen. The mudroom light was off. The door to the garage was visible beyond it. The handle remained still. Another small contact came from lower down, near the baseboard. Denise called from the front hallway. "You ready?" I didn't answer. A square mark appeared in the white paint beside the garage entrance. I watched it happen. There was no hand, no object. The wood simply pressed inward at one point, as if something hard had struck from the surface itself. I backed away. A second dent appeared several inches higher. Then a third near the handle. Denise came into the kitchen. "What are you doing?" I pointed. The garage door handle moved. She saw that. I know she did, because she stopped walking. The lever lowered. The door opened 2 inches. Cold air came through the gap. Denise whispered, "Is someone in there?" I grabbed the heaviest thing nearby, a cast iron skillet. She pulled out her phone. The door opened farther. The garage beyond was dark. I reached around the kitchen wall and turned on the exterior garage light. Empty. My car was parked outside because the garage was filled with boxes. The side entrance was locked. We searched together. Nobody. Then Denise noticed the concrete. Near the inside door were 4 square impressions in a thin layer of dust. They did not look like shoe prints. They appeared in a line about the width of a hand. She took pictures. Neither of us discussed sleep paralysis after that. We left. I stayed with her for 3 nights. During that time, the house remained empty. I checked it in daylight only. Nothing obvious changed. I considered hiring someone to finish clearing the property. The cost would have been painful, but I was close to doing it. Then I got angry with myself. I had inherited a house, not a curse. There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had access. Maybe a former contractor had a key. Perhaps Dad had been frightened by a trespasser and never told anyone. The physical marks actually made me more willing to consider a human cause. I changed both exterior locks. I installed inexpensive motion cameras at the front entrance, garage, kitchen, and upstairs landing. I also placed one in my bedroom facing the door. I did not return alone the first night. My friend Marcus came with me. He knew about Dad's death, but not the full story. I told him I thought somebody might have entered the property. We checked every room. The basement windows were locked. The small attic hatch in the upstairs hall had not been disturbed. There was no crawl space large enough for someone to hide. We stayed downstairs watching television until almost 2. Nothing happened. Marcus slept on the living room sofa. I went upstairs. I lay on my left side. The camera's small green light remained visible on the dresser. I fell asleep quickly. At 3:24, I woke because the mattress moved. Not much, just enough that I felt weight settle near my feet. I opened my eyes. The bedroom was dark. I could move. I tested my fingers immediately. They worked. I turned my head. Nothing stood beside the bed. Then the mattress dipped again, closer as though someone had placed one knee on the lower corner. I kicked the blanket away and sat up. The pressure vanished. I switched on the lamp. Empty room. The chair remained beneath the handle. I looked toward the camera. The green light was off. I got out of bed. The device had been unplugged. The cable lay on the floor. I had taped it against the dresser so it couldn't fall loose. The tape remained in place. The plug itself had been pulled from the back of the camera. I woke Marcus. We reviewed the footage from the other cameras. At 3:21, the upstairs landing camera recorded a short burst of static. Then, the image froze for 11 seconds. When it returned, nothing was visible. My bedroom unit stopped recording at 3:22. The final frame showed the closed door. We checked the mattress. On the blanket near my feet were 4 square impressions. Each looked as though something small and hard had pressed into the fabric. Marcus saw them. He touched one. What makes a shape like that? I had no answer. He stayed the rest of the night in my room while I sat in the chair. The next morning, we pulled the bed away from the wall. One of the wooden slats beneath the mattress had cracked. It had not been broken the day before. That was enough for me. I arranged for a clearance company to remove the remaining furniture. I planned to stay at Denise's until the sale. I packed clothes, documents, and anything personal I wanted to keep. The last thing I needed from the basement was Dad's red metal toolbox. It contained his old watch, some family paperwork, and several tools that had belonged to my grandfather. I went down shortly after noon. Every light was on. The toolbox sat under the workbench. I carried it upstairs and left it near the kitchen. As I turned toward the basement entrance, something shifted below. I stopped. A faint dragging noise came from the rec room. I told myself I was not going back down. Then I heard Dad's cassette recorder. His voice came from the workshop. 23 1/4. Pause. Need longer screws. I stood frozen. The recorder was upstairs in a box. I had packed it days earlier. His voice continued from below. Replace hinge. Then silence. I closed the basement door. I locked it. I left the house. For 2 weeks, I did not sleep there. The clearance crew emptied almost everything. The estate agent scheduled photographs for a Tuesday morning. I returned Monday evening because I wanted to clean the kitchen and remove the last personal items. Denise planned to join me after dinner. A thunderstorm started around 6. By 7, rain was hammering the roof hard enough to overwhelm the gutters. At 7:40, Denise called. A tree had come down across the road near her neighborhood. She would be late. I told her not to rush. The house was almost empty by then. Without furniture, every noise carried farther. My footsteps echoed. The living room looked larger than I remembered. I cleaned until around 9. Then, the power went out. The entire house went black. I swore. My phone still had plenty of battery, so I used the flashlight. I called the utility company. The automated message said there was an outage affecting several streets. Ordinary problem. I decided to wait in the kitchen for Denise. The rain softened after a while. That was when I heard something upstairs. Not footsteps. A measured sequence of tiny hard contacts along the banister. One near the top, another slightly lower. Then a third. The noises descended. I stood near the kitchen doorway with my phone light aimed toward the hall. A small, dark shape appeared around the bend in the staircase. A hand. It rested on the wooden rail. For a moment, I thought an actual person had entered the house. Then the beam caught the fingertips. Each one ended in a flat square of dark brown material. The pieces were where fingernails should have been, but they covered more of the ends, wrapping slightly over the skin. They looked like polished wooden plugs embedded into the fingers. The hand moved lower. Each square touched the banister with a different dry note. Then an arm came into view. Gray shirt, ordinary skin. The person descended another step. I backed into the kitchen. "Who are you?" No answer. The figure came farther down. It was a man, not my father. He looked perhaps 50, thin through the shoulders, wearing gray trousers and a faded button-up shirt. His hair was short. His face seemed normal at first. Then I noticed his eyes were closed, not squeezed shut, relaxed, as though he were asleep. He continued walking. His eyelids never opened. I raised my phone. "I've called the police." That was a lie. I had not. The man stopped at the bottom of the stairs. His head tilted slightly toward my voice. The fingertips touched the newel post. 4 little wooden contacts. He smiled. My body reacted before I understood anything. My arms became heavy. The phone slipped lower in my hand. A wave of exhaustion passed through me so quickly that my knees softened. I knew that sensation. It was exactly what I had felt during the lucid dream attempt. I stumbled backward. No, the man stepped into the hall. My jaw became difficult to move. I tried shouting. Only air came out. The phone fell. The light spun across the floor and stopped sideways, throwing a pale beam along the lower wall. I could still move, but slowly. The paralysis was coming while I was standing. That terrified me more than anything before it. I grabbed the kitchen counter. The man entered the room. His closed eyes faced me. His hands hung at his sides. The dark squares at the ends of his fingers made soft contacts against his trousers. I felt anger building again. Not naturally. It arrived like a switch being thrown. A violent urge to attack him. The same blind rage I had felt the first night. For one dangerous second, it felt good. My body became easier to move. I picked up a heavy ceramic bowl from the counter. The man smiled wider. That was when I understood something. The anger was not helping me. He wanted it. Dad's notebook came back to me. "If you get up angry, don't follow it downstairs." I put the bowl down. The rage surged harder. My hands shook with the need to grab something, hit him, break something, move toward him. I forced myself backward instead. The man's smile disappeared. He came forward quickly. I turned and ran toward the mudroom. He caught the back of my shirt. The force nearly pulled me off my feet. I grabbed the doorframe. His fingers closed around my shoulder. Those wooden caps dug through the fabric. Pain shot down my arm. I kicked backward and connected with his leg. He pulled harder. The shirt tore. I slipped free and fell into the mudroom. The garage entrance was 3 feet away. I reached for the handle. Before I touched it, the door slammed shut from the other side of the frame as if something had yanked it. I tried again. Locked. I had not locked it. Behind me, the man entered the mudroom. He still hadn't opened his eyes. I grabbed a metal broom handle leaning beside the washing machine and swung. It struck his shoulder. Solid impact. He staggered. I hit him again. One of the dark fingertip pieces scraped the wall as he reached for me. A square chip of painted drywall came away. He grabbed the broom. For a second, we fought over it. His strength was far greater than his size suggested. He pulled me forward. I let go. He stumbled backward with the broom. I lunged for the kitchen. His hand caught my ankle. I hit the floor. My chin struck the threshold. Warm blood filled my mouth. He began dragging me backward, toward the kitchen, toward the basement entrance beyond it. I clawed at the floor. My fingertips slid across the tile. He pulled again. My hip struck the wall. The basement door opened. Darkness beyond. I screamed. This time my voice worked. I reached for the leg of a small utility table. It tipped over. Cleaning bottles crashed around me. The man dragged me another foot. I could hear the basement stairs behind him. I knew where he was taking me. Dad's workshop. The rage came back stronger than before. My thoughts narrowed until there was almost nothing left except the urge to turn and hurt him. I understood why my father had written that note. Fear made you freeze. Anger made you chase. Maybe that was how it moved you where it wanted. I stopped fighting. Completely, I went limp. The man paused. His grip loosened slightly. I rolled onto my back. His closed eyes were inches above me. For the first time, I saw the wooden squares clearly. They were not attached over the nails. They had grown through them. Thin lines of skin folded around the edges. One was cracked from where I had hit his hand. A dark red line showed beneath it. He leaned closer. I whispered, "I'm not following you." His expression changed. The smile vanished. I kicked him in the chest with both feet. He fell backward into the kitchen. I scrambled toward the living room. Behind me, the basement door slammed. The house shook. I reached the front entrance. The deadbolt would not turn. I pulled until my fingers hurt. The upstairs floor creaked. I looked back. The man was no longer in the kitchen. A second-floor bedroom door closed. Then another. The bathroom. The office. Dad's room. My childhood bedroom last. Every handle moved once. Then, silence. I grabbed a dining chair and smashed it through the narrow window beside the front entrance. Glass fell onto the porch. I reached through carefully and unlocked the outer screen door. Then I climbed through the broken opening rather than stay inside long enough to fight the deadbolt. I cut my forearm badly on the frame. I ran into the rain. Denise arrived less than 5 minutes later. She found me sitting near the curb with blood on my face, arm, and shirt. She called 911. Police searched the house. Nobody was inside. Every exterior entrance was locked. The garage side door was secure. The basement windows had not been disturbed. The utility area contained clear signs of a struggle. The small table was overturned. Bottles were scattered across the floor. There were blood drops from my chin. My torn shirt lay partly in the kitchen. The drywall beside the washing machine had 4 square gouges arranged in a curve. One officer photographed them. The basement entrance stood open. At the bottom of the stairs, they found my father's red toolbox. I had left it upstairs beside the kitchen hours earlier. The lid was open. Inside was his spiral notebook. I had packed that notebook in my car. Denise knew because she had seen me put it there 2 weeks earlier. We checked. The box where I had stored it was empty. The police had no explanation. They suggested I may have carried it inside without remembering. I didn't argue. The following morning, Denise returned with me and a contractor to secure the broken window. Daylight made the house look ordinary again. That almost made me angrier than the previous night. My shoulder was badly bruised. 5 square marks had formed through the torn fabric. The contractor inspected the mudroom wall. He dug at one of the gouges with a small screwdriver. Something was embedded in the plaster. He pulled it free. A dark brown square about the size of a fingernail, smooth on one side, rough and reddish underneath. Denise immediately stepped away. The contractor asked if it was wood. I said I didn't know. He placed it on a paper towel. Nobody touched it with bare hands. I put it inside a small plastic container. I still have it. The house sold 6 weeks later. I never spent another night there. For a while, I believed leaving would end everything. Mostly, it did. I stopped trying to control my dreams. I also stopped sleeping on my back. Even now, if I wake and realize I'm lying flat, my heart starts racing before I'm fully conscious. The worst part was what happened to my memory of Dad. For years, I had wanted one final dream in which I could apologize. After the house, I didn't want to dream of him at all. Whenever he appeared, I woke myself immediately. I became afraid that grief had been the thing that opened the door in the first place. Eventually, that fear faded. Not completely. Enough that I could sleep normally most nights. 2 years after selling the house, Denise called me. She had been clearing old files from her phone and found pictures from the morning after the attack. She sent several because she thought I might want copies for insurance records. One showed the mudroom wall. Another showed the broken front window. The last was a photograph I had never seen. She had taken it upstairs while the contractor worked downstairs. It showed my childhood bedroom entrance. The 3 square dents beside the latch were still there. Below them, much lower on the frame, were 5 newer impressions. They formed the outline of a hand. I called her immediately. "Did you see those when you took this?" "No. You didn't notice?" I was photographing the damage. I zoomed in. There was something else. The bedroom door was open just enough to show part of the mattress. The bed had been stripped before the house went on the market. No sheets, no blanket, nothing on it. Yet the center of the mattress was compressed as if someone were lying flat on their back. Both arms were at their side.